Illusory truth effect. The illusory truth effect is a psychological phenomenon that reveals just how easily our brains can mistake familiarity for truth. It happens when a statement, idea, or claim is repeated often enough that we start to believe it, even if there is no evidence to support it. The human brain is naturally wired to conserve energy. Constantly verifying every fact takes effort, so instead it uses mental shortcuts. One of those shortcuts is simple familiarity. If something feels familiar, our mind assumes it's more likely to be true. This bias may have helped our ancestors survive by trusting repeated warnings about dangers. But in the modern world, it leaves us open to misinformation. Think about the false ideas you've probably heard 100 times. We only use 10% of our brain. Sugar makes kids hyperactive. Or lightning never strikes the same place twice. None of these statements are accurate, yet they persist because they have been repeated so frequently that they now feel like common knowledge. Advertisers and politicians understand this perfectly. A slogan like, "Red Bull gives you wings," has nothing to do with literal flight, yet repeated exposure makes you link the brand with energy and alertness. Similarly, a politician might repeat, "We have the strongest economy in history," so many times that voters accept it as truth without checking the data. In 1977, researchers Lynn Hasher, David Goldstein, and Thomas Topino demonstrated this effect in a controlled experiment. Participants were shown statements, some true and some false, multiple times. The more often a statement appeared, the more likely participants were to believe it was accurate, even without any supporting evidence. Modern studies have confirmed that this bias works even when people are explicitly told that a statement is false. The repetition alone creates a sense of truth. Protecting yourself from the illusory truth effect requires conscious effort. You need to question repeated claims, no matter how familiar they feel, and actively seek out credible sources. Ask yourself who benefits from you believing a statement and whether the information is supported by independent evidence. Exposing yourself to a variety of perspectives can also help break the repetition loop, as can recognizing when an emotional delivery is being used to make a message stick in your mind. The illusory truth effect is one of the most powerful tools used in marketing, politics, and propaganda, but awareness is the first step to resisting it. Once you start paying attention, you'll see how often it's being used on you, and you'll be far less likely to fall for it. Zeigarnik Effect. Unfinished tasks and mental loops. The Zeigarnik Effect is a fascinating psychological phenomenon that explains why unfinished tasks stick in our minds far more than completed ones. Discovered by Russian psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik in the 1920s, the effect came to light when she noticed that waiters in a cafe could easily remember unpaid orders, but quickly forgot the details once the bill was settled. Her experiments confirmed that people have a stronger memory for incomplete or interrupted tasks than for tasks that have been finished. The human brain views unfinished work as an open loop, something unresolved that demands closure. This creates a subtle but persistent mental tension that keeps the task alive in our minds until it is completed. You've likely experienced this yourself. Think about the way a cliffhanger at the end of a TV episode makes it hard to stop watching, even if you weren't deeply invested in the show. The unresolved plot compels you to keep thinking about what happens next. The same thing happens with arguments that end without resolution. Your mind replays what you could have said long after the conversation is over. Even incomplete chores can nag at you. A half-cleaned room can feel more mentally distracting than one you haven't started at all, because you've already engaged with it and left it hanging. The Zeigarnik effect is used deliberately in marketing and storytelling. Advertisers design teaser campaigns that offer just enough information to spark curiosity but leave important details out, encouraging you to keep seeking more. Online courses and apps often use progress bars to show that you're almost done, knowing your brain will push you to finish. Writers, filmmakers, and TV producers end scenes or episodes mid-action to make sure you come back for the next part. Salespeople may offer a free trial or partial service, leaving you in the middle of the experience so you feel the urge to complete it by making a purchase. This effect can be both a blessing and a curse. On the positive side, it can increase motivation, starting a project, even in a small way. often makes you more likely to finish it. For studying, deliberately stopping in the middle of a chapter can make it easier to pick up where you left off, because your brain will naturally want to close the loop. But it can also lead to stress, overthinking, and sleepless nights if too many tasks remain unfinished. People with perfectionist tendencies may find the Zeigarnik effect particularly exhausting, because their minds hold on to every incomplete detail until it's resolved. Managing the Zeigarnik effect comes down to creating a sense of closure, even without fully completing the task. Writing down unfinished tasks in a to-do list or brain dump can help your mind relax because it feels like you've secured the information for later. Breaking large projects into smaller, achievable steps allows you to close some loops along the way, instead of carrying the entire mental burden until the very end. By understanding how the Zeigarnik effect works, you can use it to fuel productivity rather than let it trap you in constant mental loops. It's a tool for motivation if you control it, but a source of frustration if you don't. Reverse psychology. Reverse psychology is a subtle yet powerful persuasion technique that works by encouraging someone to do the opposite of what you are actually suggesting. At its core, it relies on a human trait known as reactance, the instinctive resistance we feel when we believe our freedom to choose is being restricted. When someone tells us we can't or shouldn't do something, a part of us immediately feels the urge to rebel and prove them wrong. This reaction can be so strong that it drives people to take actions they might not have considered otherwise, purely to reassert their sense of independence. You can see reverse psychology play out in everyday life. A teenager who was never interested in going to a party might suddenly insist on attending if their parents say, "You're not allowed to go." A child who refuses to eat vegetables might take a bite after a parent sighs and says, "Fine, I guess you're just not strong enough to handle broccoli." Marketers have long understood the appeal of the forbidden. When a product is labeled as only for the most daring buyers or limited to exclusive members, it becomes more intriguing. The Scarcity Principle strengthens this effect, because if something is off-limits, our minds assume it must be special or valuable. In sales, reverse psychology can be used to close deals with hesitant buyers. A salesperson might say, "You're probably not interested in this offer, and that's perfectly fine," which subtly prompts the customer to prove that they are interested. In leadership, managers and coaches sometimes frame challenges in a way that triggers this instinct. A coach might tell an athlete, "I doubt you can handle one more lap," knowing that the athlete's pride will push them to prove otherwise. Used wisely, reverse psychology can inspire people to push beyond their own limitations and accomplish more than they thought possible. However, it's not without risks. If someone detects that you're trying to manipulate them, the tactic can backfire, leading to mistrust or resentment. In toxic relationships, reverse psychology can be used in harmful ways, such as saying, "Fine, leave if you want," with the hidden goal of provoking guilt or fear to make the other person stay. It can also create unnecessary conflicts if overused, because it relies on challenging someone's autonomy rather than openly communicating. The key to using reverse psychology effectively is subtlety and sincerity. It should be applied in situations where the other person's natural instincts will work in your favor, not as a constant manipulation strategy. Equally important is recognizing when it's being used on you. If you find yourself wanting to do something just because someone suggested you shouldn't, pause and ask yourself if this action truly aligns with your goals, or if you're simply reacting to the challenge. Reverse psychology taps into a deep part of human behavior, and when you understand it, you can decide whether to resist its pull or use it carefully to motivate action. Anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is a cognitive bias that occurs when we rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive, the anchor, when making decisions or judgments. This anchor becomes a mental reference point, shaping how we interpret and evaluate everything that follows. The bias is so strong that even irrelevant or arbitrary starting points can influence our choices without us realizing it. In other words, our brains latch onto that first number, idea, or impression, and all subsequent thinking is subtly pulled toward it, even if the anchor is misleading. Consider how this works in everyday life. Imagine you're shopping for a jacket and the first one you see is priced at $500. Even if you think that's expensive, it becomes your anchor. When you later see a $300 jacket, it feels like a bargain, even though $300 is still a high price. In another example, a real estate agent might first show you a house that is far above your budget so that when you see a slightly cheaper one, it suddenly feels more reasonable, even if it's still overpriced. In negotiations, the person who speaks first and sets an initial number often controls the psychological territory because the final agreement tends to gravitate around that opening figure. Anchoring bias can also influence non-monetary decisions. If you meet someone for the first time and they make a slightly arrogant remark, your impression of them may be anchored to that moment, affecting how you interpret their future behavior. In news reporting, the way a story is first framed can anchor public opinion for weeks or months, even if later evidence contradicts it. This is why political campaigns and advertisers work hard to set the narrative early. Because once the anchor is in place, it's difficult to move it. Research has shown how irrational anchoring can be. In a well-known experiment by psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, participants were asked to spin a wheel with numbers on it before guessing the percentage of African nations in the United Nations. Although the wheel was rigged to stop at either 10 or 65, completely unrelated to the question, participants who saw the higher number guessed much higher percentages than those who saw the lower number. This demonstrated that even meaningless anchors can shape our judgments. While anchoring bias is almost impossible to eliminate, we can learn to reduce its impact. The first step is awareness. Recognize when an initial number, idea, or impression might be disproportionately influencing your decision. Seeking out independent information before making judgments can help counter the effect, as can deliberately considering alternative anchors. In negotiations, avoid making snap agreements based on the first offer. And in shopping, take time to research average prices instead of comparing only to the first one you see. Anchoring is a natural mental shortcut, but if we let it go unchecked, it can lead us into decisions that feel logical in the moment, yet are shaped more by the starting point than by reality. Ben Franklin Effect. The Ben Franklin Effect is a curious psychological phenomenon where doing a favor for someone actually makes you like them more, even if you didn't have a positive opinion of them before. At first, this sounds backward. We tend to think we help people because we already like them, but the Ben Franklin Effect flips that logic. The idea is rooted in cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort we feel when our actions and beliefs don't align. When we do something kind for someone we don't particularly like, our brain tries to resolve the conflict by adjusting our attitude toward them. Instead of thinking, I did them a favor, even though I dislike them, our mind reinterprets the situation as, I must like them, or else I wouldn't have helped. The effect gets its name from a story Benjamin Franklin told in his autobiography. While serving in the Pennsylvania legislature, Franklin wanted to win over a political rival. Instead of offering a gift or compliment, he asked the man if he could borrow a rare and valuable book from his personal collection. The man agreed, and Franklin promptly returned the book with a gracious thank you note. From that point on, the two became friendly, and Franklin noted that the man treated him with more warmth than before. Franklin understood that asking for a small, meaningful favor could create a sense of connection and goodwill. This phenomenon can be seen in everyday situations. Imagine a coworker you barely know lending you their charger after you ask for it. The act of helping you can subtly shift their perception, making them feel more positively toward you. In relationships, small requests, like asking for advice or assistance, can foster closeness because the person doing the favor unconsciously invests in the relationship. The same principle is used in sales and networking. Asking for small, non-intrusive help first can open the door for stronger rapport and future cooperation. Psychologists believe the Ben Franklin effect works because of self-perception theory, which suggests we learn about our own attitudes by observing our behavior. If we notice ourselves helping someone, we infer that we must like or at least respect them, even if we didn't start out feeling that way. The effect also ties into our need for consistency. We want our actions and beliefs to align, so we adjust our beliefs to match our actions. However, the effect is not foolproof. If a request is too large or feels manipulative, it can backfire, making the person resent you instead. timing, context, and the nature of the favor all matter. The request should be small enough to be easy, but personal enough to create a sense of investment. Knowing how to use the Ben Franklin effect can be a subtle but powerful tool in building relationships, overcoming hostility, and creating unexpected alliances. When applied with authenticity and respect, it turns small acts of assistance into bridges between people who might otherwise remain strangers or even rivals. Paradox of choice. The paradox of choice is the counterintuitive idea that while having some choices is essential for freedom and satisfaction, having too many options can actually make us less happy. At first, it seems obvious that more choice should be better. After all, it gives us more freedom to find something that fits our needs perfectly. But psychologist Barry Schwartz, who popularized the term in his 2004 book, The Paradox of Choice, argues that an overabundance of options can overwhelm us, increase anxiety, and even lead to decision paralysis. In other words, when there are too many possibilities, making a decision becomes harder, not easier. You've probably experienced this while shopping. Walking into a store with 2 or 3 brands of a product is simple. You compare quickly, choose one, and move on. But when you're faced with 50 different variations, your mind starts overanalyzing every detail. Price, features, reviews, aesthetics. You spend more time comparing than deciding, and even after you make a choice, you may feel less satisfied because you can't stop thinking about the alternatives you didn't pick. This effect isn't limited to shopping. It applies to nearly every area of life, from dating apps with endless swiping to streaming platforms with hundreds of movies you never actually watch. Schwartz identified 2 main types of decision-makers: maximizers and satisficers. Maximizers want the absolute best and will keep searching until they are certain they've found it, which means they invest enormous amounts of time and energy in decision-making and are more likely to experience regret afterward. Satisficers, on the other hand, choose the first option that meets their standards and are generally happier with their decisions. In a world with limitless options, maximizers are far more vulnerable to the downsides of the paradox of choice because every decision feels like a test of perfection. Research supports the idea that too many choices can reduce happiness. In a famous study by psychologists Sheena Iyengar and Mark Lepper, shoppers were presented with either 6 or 24 varieties of jam. While more people stopped to look at the table with 24 jams, those presented with only 6 options were 10 times more likely to make a purchase. The conclusion was clear. While variety draws attention, too much variety can overwhelm the decision-making process and reduce follow-through. The paradox of choice also contributes to what psychologists call post-decision regret. When there are many alternatives, it's easier to imagine that another choice would have been better, leading to dissatisfaction even if the option you picked is perfectly fine. In extreme cases, the sheer weight of choice can lead to decision avoidance, where people procrastinate or refuse to decide altogether. The key to avoiding the negative effects of the paradox of choice is to set clear criteria before making decisions, limit the number of options you consider, and focus on good enough rather than perfect. By narrowing your choices intentionally, you reduce mental overload and increase the likelihood of feeling confident and content with your decision. Freedom of choice is valuable, but only when it empowers us, not when it traps us in an endless loop of what-ifs and second-guessing. Door-in-the-face technique. The door-in-the-face technique is a clever persuasion strategy that works by making an initial request so large and unrealistic that the other person is almost certain to reject it, followed by a much smaller, more reasonable request that they are far more likely to accept. The power of this technique lies in contrast. When the second request is compared to the first, it feels much smaller and more manageable, even if it would have seemed like a big ask on its own. Psychologists explain this effect through the principle of reciprocity, the idea that when someone appears to compromise, we feel a social obligation to reciprocate by meeting them halfway. This technique is used in countless situations without us even realizing it. A charity worker might first ask for a $500 donation, knowing most people will say no, then compromise by asking for just $50. A salesperson might try to sell you the most expensive product first, and when you decline, they immediately offer a cheaper model, which now feels like a bargain in comparison. Even in personal relationships, this tactic appears. A friend might ask for an enormous favor, like helping them move to another city, and when you refuse, they scale down the request to helping them pack for a few hours. Because the second request feels so much smaller, you're more inclined to agree. The name door in the face comes from the imagery of slamming a door in someone's face after a big request, only for them to come back with a smaller one that you're willing to consider. Research has proven its effectiveness. In a classic 1975 study by Robert Cialdini and his colleagues, participants were first asked to volunteer as mentors for troubled youth for 2 years, a request most declined. Then they were asked to chaperone the youth on a single-day trip to the zoo, and far more people agreed compared to those who were only given the smaller request from the start. The act of conceding made people more willing to say yes. However, the technique only works under certain conditions. The two requests must be related in subject matter, and the second must be noticeably smaller but still significant. If the first request is so outrageous that it seems like a joke, or if the second request is too tiny, the effect is lost. It's also important that the shift from the large request to the small one feels genuine. People can sense when they're being manipulated, and that can backfire, damaging trust. When used ethically, the door-in-the-face technique can help bridge gaps in negotiations, fundraising, and problem-solving by making compromise feel natural. But when used dishonestly, it can be a manipulative way to pressure people into saying yes to things they might not have agreed to under normal circumstances. Understanding this technique allows you to use it strategically and also recognize when someone else is using it on you. Once you see it in action, you'll notice it everywhere, from sales pitches to political campaigns to casual conversations. Foot in the door technique. The foot in the door technique is a psychological persuasion method that works in the opposite way to the door-in-the-face approach. Instead of starting with an unreasonably large request and then scaling down, it begins with a very small, easy-to-agree-to request. Once a person agrees to this small action, they are much more likely to comply with a larger, related request later. The reasoning behind this technique is rooted in the human desire for consistency. Once we've taken a small step in a particular direction, our self-image begins to shift, and we feel inclined to behave in ways that align with our earlier actions. An everyday example is a charity campaigner who first asked you to sign a petition for a cause. Signing takes only seconds and requires almost no commitment. But later they follow up by asking for a donation to the same cause, and because you've already shown support, you feel more inclined to contribute. In sales, a company might offer a free trial or sample, getting you to commit to using the product in a small way, and then later present you with a paid subscription offer. Even in personal relationships, the technique works. Someone might ask for a small favor like holding their bag for a moment, and once you agree, you're more open to helping them with something bigger. The effect was famously demonstrated in a 1966 study by Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser. In their experiment, researchers asked homeowners to display a small sticker supporting safe driving in their window. Later, those same homeowners were much more likely to agree to place a large, unattractive sign in their yard, promoting the same message compared to people who were only asked about the large sign from the start. The small action had paved the way for the bigger one. This technique works because of our need for internal consistency. Once we say yes to something, we unconsciously start seeing ourselves as the kind of person who supports that cause, product, or request. Saying no later creates a kind of mental discomfort, cognitive dissonance, because it would contradict the self-image we've just reinforced. Agreeing feels easier and more natural than backtracking. However, the foot-in-the-door technique can be misused in manipulative ways. For example, a scammer might first get you to answer a harmless survey question, then escalate to asking for personal information. Or a company might start with a free offer that subtly commits you to ongoing costs later. Being aware of how this technique works helps you recognize when your willingness to agree is based more on your earlier small commitment than on genuine interest in the larger request. Used ethically, the foot-in-the-door technique is a powerful tool for building trust, encouraging positive behavior change, and persuading others over time. It's not about forcing people to agree, but about guiding them into a mindset where saying yes feels like a natural continuation of the steps they've already taken. Whether in marketing, advocacy, or personal influence, it shows that small beginnings can open the door to much larger outcomes. Decoy Effect. The Decoy Effect, also known as the asymmetric dominance effect, is a subtle but powerful tactic used to influence decision-making by introducing a third option that is deliberately less attractive. This decoy is not meant to be chosen. Its purpose is to make one of the other two options appear more appealing. By carefully designing the decoy so that it is inferior in all ways to the target choice, but still somewhat comparable, decision-makers are gently steered toward the option the seller or influencer wants them to pick. What makes this effect so fascinating is that it exploits our tendency to compare things relative to one another rather than evaluating them in isolation. A common example can be found in pricing strategies. Imagine a coffee shop offering two sizes, a small for $3 and a large for $6. Many customers might choose the small to save money, but if the shop introduces a medium for $5 to $50, only slightly cheaper than the large but noticeably smaller, the large suddenly seems like a much better deal. Most customers will gravitate toward it, even though they might have originally been content with the small. The medium acts as the decoy, making the large the clear value choice. This tactic is widely used in marketing, retail, and subscription services. For instance, a streaming platform might offer 3 plans: basic for $8, premium for $12, and ultra for $15. If the ultra plan has only a minor advantage over premium, many people might stick with premium. But if the ultra plan is intentionally overpriced for its value, and the premium plan is positioned to look vastly better than basic, more people will choose premium. In this way, the ultra plan becomes the decoy, existing only to make the middle option more attractive. Psychological research has shown that the decoy effect can significantly alter consumer behavior. It works because our brains are wired to avoid extremes and seek out what appears to be the best deal in a given set of options. The presence of the decoy simplifies the decision-making process by pushing us toward what feels like the most rational choice, even though that rationality is manufactured. While the decoy effect can be harmless in everyday purchases, it can also be used to manipulate decisions in larger, more impactful contexts, such as insurance plans, loan offers, or political proposals. Being aware of it helps you question whether you're making a decision because it truly fits your needs or because it's been made to look better in comparison to a strategically placed alternative. For those who use it ethically, the decoy effect can guide people toward beneficial choices without forcing them. But for those on the receiving end, recognizing the tactic allows for more independent thinking. The next time you see 3 options, one clearly inferior to another but suspiciously close in price or features, ask yourself whether that bad option exists simply to make another one irresistible. Scarcity Principle. The Scarcity Principle is a psychological concept that explains why people tend to place a higher value on things that are rare, limited, or hard to obtain. It's rooted in a basic human survival instinct. In our evolutionary past, resources like food, shelter, and mates were often limited, so anything scarce was perceived as more valuable and worth pursuing. In the modern world, this instinct still shapes our decisions, even when the scarcity is artificially created. When something is in short supply, we feel an urgency to act quickly before the opportunity disappears, often without stopping to fully consider whether we truly need it. Marketers, advertisers, and salespeople exploit this principle constantly. You've probably seen phrases like "only 2 left in stock," "limited time offer," or "sale ends at midnight." These aren't just informational. They're triggers designed to spark fear of missing out and push you into making faster decisions. Airlines do this when they display "only 3 seats left at this price," prompting travelers to book immediately. Real estate agents use it by saying multiple buyers are already interested in the same property, even if it's only been on the market for a day. The scarcity principle is also at play in social situations. Exclusive clubs, VIP memberships, and invite-only events feel more prestigious precisely because not everyone has access. People often seek status through items that are rare or hard to get, like limited edition sneakers, luxury watches, or concert tickets that sell out within minutes. The more limited something appears, the more desirable it becomes, not necessarily because of its intrinsic value, but because scarcity signals importance in our minds. Psychological studies have shown that scarcity increases not only perceived value, but also emotional intensity. In a famous experiment, participants rated cookies as more desirable when they were taken from a jar that contained just 2, compared to a jar with 10 identical cookies. Nothing about the cookies themselves had changed, only the quantity. This illustrates how scarcity can cloud objective judgment, making us feel like we need something urgently simply because it's harder to get. However, the scarcity principle can lead to impulsive and sometimes regrettable decisions. People often buy products they don't need, overpay for items, or rush into commitments just because they believe the chance won't come again. Recognizing when scarcity is being used as a tactic, especially when it's artificially manufactured, can help you make calmer, more rational choices. Before acting on scarcity-driven urgency, it's worth asking whether the opportunity is truly rare or if it's just being framed that way to manipulate your behavior. When used ethically, scarcity can be a motivator that pushes people to take action on valuable opportunities they might otherwise delay. But when used dishonestly, it preys on our instincts and leads to unnecessary spending, rushed decisions, and even buyer's remorse. Understanding the scarcity principle means you can pause, think, and decide based on value rather than urgency, and that awareness alone can save you from a lot of manipulation. Framing effect. The framing effect is a cognitive bias that shows how the way information is presented, or framed, can drastically influence the decisions we make, even when the underlying facts remain the same. Our brains don't process information in a purely logical or objective way. Instead, we respond emotionally to context, wording, and emphasis. A positive frame can make an option seem far more appealing, while a negative frame can make the same option feel risky or undesirable. The most fascinating part is that this effect works even when we know the framing is happening. Our decisions are still swayed. Consider a common example from marketing. A product labeled as 90% fat-free is often perceived more positively than the same product labeled contains 10% fat. The factual content is identical, but the framing changes the emotional response. In healthcare, this can have serious implications. If a doctor says, "This surgery has a 90% survival rate," most patients feel reassured. But if they say, "There's a 10% chance of death," patients are more likely to reject the procedure, even though the statistics are the same. Politicians and media outlets use framing constantly, knowing that word choice can subtly influence public opinion without altering the facts themselves. Psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman famously demonstrated the framing effect in a 1981 experiment. Participants were asked to choose between 2 treatments for a disease expected to kill 600 people. One treatment was framed in terms of lives saved, 200 people will be saved, while the other was framed in terms of lives lost, 400 people will die. Even though the outcomes were logically identical, most people chose the lives saved option when it was framed positively and avoided the lives lost option when framed negatively. This bias occurs because framing taps into our risk perception and emotional triggers. Positive framing tends to make us risk-averse, while negative framing often pushes us toward risk-taking behavior in hopes of avoiding loss. Advertisers, negotiators, and politicians deliberately use framing to guide choices in their favor, often without the audience realizing they've been nudged in a certain direction. To guard against the framing effect, it's important to consciously reframe information in your own mind. If you hear a statement framed positively, try restating it in negative terms, and vice versa, to see if it changes your perspective. Comparing both versions can help you focus on the actual facts rather than the emotional spin. This skill is especially useful when making financial decisions, evaluating medical options, or interpreting news stories. Ultimately, the framing effect reminds us that perception is just as influential as reality when it comes to decision-making. 2 people can look at the same data and draw entirely different conclusions simply because of how the information was presented to them. By becoming aware of this bias, you gain the ability to step back, remove the emotional filter, and make choices based on facts rather than presentation. Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, frequency illusion. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, also known as the frequency illusion, is the strange experience of noticing something for the first time and then suddenly seeing it everywhere. It's as if the universe is deliberately placing it in your path, but in reality, nothing supernatural is happening. It's simply your brain's pattern recognition system kicking into overdrive. Once an idea, object, or concept enters your awareness, your mind becomes more attuned to spotting it, creating the illusion that its frequency has dramatically increased. For example, you might hear about a rare car model for the first time and then start spotting it on the road multiple times a week. Or perhaps you learn a new word and suddenly encounter it in books, conversations, and social media posts. In reality, these things were likely always there, but your brain filtered them out before because they weren't relevant to you. Now that they have personal meaning, your mind notices them and flags them as important. This phenomenon is powered by two cognitive processes: selective attention and confirmation bias. Selective attention means we naturally focus on things that matter to us while ignoring countless other details in our environment. Once something becomes relevant, our mental filter shifts to let it through. Confirmation bias then reinforces this shift. Each time we notice the item again, it confirms our belief that it's appearing more often, even if the actual frequency hasn't changed. The term Baader-Meinhof comes from a curious incident in the 1990s when a Minnesota newspaper reader mentioned learning about the German terrorist group Baader-Meinhof for the first time, only to hear about them again within days. This sparked a conversation among readers about similar experiences, and the name stuck, despite having nothing to do with the group's actual history. Marketers and media outlets often benefit from the frequency illusion. Once you've been exposed to an ad for a product, you're more likely to notice it in stores, online, and in conversations, making it seem omnipresent. Social media algorithms also amplify this effect. The moment you show interest in a topic, you're flooded with related content, further convincing you that it's suddenly everywhere. While mostly harmless, the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon can influence our perception of trends, dangers, or social patterns. For instance, hearing about a certain type of crime might make you believe it's becoming more common, simply because you start noticing news stories about it more frequently. Being aware of this bias helps you avoid jumping to conclusions based on perceived frequency alone. At its core, the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon is a reminder that our perception of reality is filtered through our own mental spotlight. The world hasn't changed, only your awareness has. Once you notice something, you can't unsee it, and from that moment on, it will seem to be everywhere you look. Halo effect. The halo effect is a powerful cognitive bias in which our overall impression of a person, brand, or thing influences how we perceive their other traits. Essentially, if we think highly of someone in one area, we tend to assume they excel in other areas too, even without evidence. This halo of positive perception can distort judgment, making us overlook flaws or give undue credit, where it isn't deserved. The opposite of this bias, where a negative impression colors everything else, is called the horn effect. You can see the halo effect everywhere. In the workplace, an employee who is physically attractive or well-dressed may be judged as more competent, intelligent, or trustworthy, even if their actual performance is average. In celebrity culture, an actor who plays a heroic character might be assumed to be equally noble in real life, despite no proof of it. Brands benefit from this bias as well. If you love one product from a company, you might assume all their products are high quality, even without trying them. Apple, for example, uses its reputation for sleek, innovative design to influence customer expectations for all its devices. The phenomenon works because humans are wired for cognitive shortcuts. Our brains want to simplify complex judgments, so instead of evaluating each trait or quality independently, we let one strong impression spill over into unrelated areas. This can be beneficial in some situations. For example, a teacher who believes a student is diligent might offer more encouragement, which in turn helps the student perform better. However, it can also lead to serious bias, such as when hiring decisions are made based on appearance, charm, or a single good impression, rather than actual qualifications. Research into the halo effect dates back to 1920, when psychologist Edward Thorndike observed that military officers tended to rate their subordinates similarly across different traits like physical appearance, leadership, and intelligence, even when those traits weren't directly related. If an officer looked strong and disciplined, they were also judged as more capable in unrelated areas. The same principle applies in marketing, politics, education, and personal relationships. First impressions are disproportionately influential. The danger of the halo effect is that it can cloud objectivity. It makes us less likely to notice red flags, poor performance, or inconsistent behavior, simply because we've already placed someone or something in a positive light. To counteract it, it's important to consciously separate traits when evaluating people or products. Ask yourself, do I actually have evidence for this belief, or is it just riding on my overall impression? The halo effect reminds us that charm, attractiveness, as or a single great quality, can create a glow that hides weaknesses. While it's human nature to make snap judgments, the wisest approach is to step back and evaluate each characteristic on its own merit. Only then can we see the person or the brand for who they truly are without the blinding glow of the halo. Horn effect. The horn effect is the darker counterpart to the halo effect. Instead of allowing one positive trait to cast a glow over everything else, the horn effect causes one negative trait or bad impression to overshadow all other qualities. When this bias takes hold, we judge someone or something more harshly in unrelated areas simply because of one unfavorable characteristic, flaw, or mistake. It's a mental shortcut that makes us see a person through a lens of negativity, often ignoring their strengths or positive actions. You've likely experienced this in everyday life. Imagine meeting someone who arrives late to a meeting. That single negative action might lead you to believe they are disorganized, unreliable, or even disrespectful, even if they're otherwise competent and kind. In the workplace, if a co-worker makes one significant error, it might permanently damage their reputation, with colleagues assuming they're careless in all aspects of their job. In the world of celebrity and politics, one scandal or poorly chosen remark can overshadow years of good work, turning public opinion almost overnight. The horn effect is especially dangerous because it narrows our perception and prevents us from seeing the full picture. It's rooted in the same mental tendency that fuels the halo effect, our desire to make quick global judgments based on limited information. This is efficient for the brain, but it often leads to unfair conclusions. A single bad encounter or a visible flaw becomes a defining feature, even when it's not representative of the person's true character or overall abilities. Psychological research shows that negative information has a stronger impact on our perceptions than positive information, a phenomenon known as the negativity bias. Because of this, the horn effect is often more powerful and longer-lasting than the halo effect. People may forgive a positive illusion over time, but they tend to hold on to negative first impressions for much longer, sometimes permanently. This bias can be harmful in professional evaluations, personal relationships, and even customer reviews. For example, if someone has one bad dining experience at a restaurant, they might assume the entire establishment is poor quality, even if it was just an off night. The horn effect can also create self-fulfilling prophecies. If a teacher believes a student is lazy because of one missed assignment, they might treat the student with less encouragement, leading to worse performance that confirms the original belief. To combat the horn effect, it's essential to slow down and separate specific behaviors or traits from the person as a whole. One flaw does not define an entire character, and one bad day does not equal incompetence. By consciously questioning whether your judgment is based on isolated incidents or consistent patterns, you can avoid letting a single negative detail distort your overall perception. Ultimately, the horn effect is a reminder that our minds can be quick to condemn based on incomplete information. If the halo effect blinds us with too much light, the horn effect blinds us with too much shadow, and both can keep us from seeing the truth clearly. Bystander Effect. The bystander effect is a psychological phenomenon in which individuals are less likely to help someone in need when other people are present. It seems counterintuitive. You'd think more witnesses would mean more help. But in reality, the presence of others often reduces the sense of personal responsibility. Each person assumes someone else will step in, and as a result, no one does. This diffusion of responsibility is one of the core reasons emergencies in public spaces sometimes unfold with little to no intervention from bystanders. The effect became widely known after the tragic 1964 murder of Kitty Genovese in New York City. Initial reports claimed that dozens of people saw or heard parts of the attack, but failed to act. While later investigations revealed the details were more complex, the case sparked a wave of psychological research into why people remain passive in the face of danger. Psychologists John Darley and Bib Latane conducted experiments showing that the likelihood of helping decreases as the number of bystanders increases. Several factors contribute to the bystander effect. Diffusion of responsibility makes individuals feel less personally accountable because they believe the responsibility is shared among everyone present. Social influence also plays a role. People look to others for cues on how to behave. If no one else is acting, it sends a subtle message that perhaps action isn't needed. There's also the fear of embarrassment or making a mistake, especially if the situation is ambiguous. The bystander effect doesn't only occur in emergencies like accidents or crimes. It can happen in everyday situations. A co-worker being spoken to unfairly in a meeting, a classmate struggling with a task, or someone being harassed online. In each case, the more people who witness the event, the less likely any individual will take action because the unspoken assumption is that someone else will handle it. Overcoming the bystander effect requires conscious effort. Research shows that individuals are far more likely to help when they are singled out or given a clear role. For example, if someone in distress points directly at you and says, "Call an ambulance," you are far more likely to act. Awareness of the phenomenon itself is another powerful tool. Knowing how our instincts work allows us to override them. Choosing to be the first to step in can inspire others to follow, breaking the cycle of inaction. The bystander effect is a sobering reminder that our instincts in group situations aren't always aligned with what's right. Courage in these moments doesn't always look like heroism. Sometimes it's as simple as being the one person who refuses to wait for someone else to make the first move. Social proof. Social proof is the psychological tendency to look to other people's behavior as a guide for what we should do, think, or believe, especially in situations where we feel uncertain. It's the mental shortcut that tells us, if everyone else is doing it, it must be right. This bias can be incredibly powerful because it taps into our deep, evolutionary need for belonging and safety. In early human history, following the group often meant survival. If the tribe was running toward the river, you didn't stop to question why. You ran with them. In the modern world, the same instinct plays out in shopping habits, social media trends, politics, and everyday decisions. You encounter social proof constantly without realizing it. Restaurant lines that stretch down the block make you assume the food must be excellent. Online, a post with thousands of likes feels more credible than one with only a handful. When choosing a product, we're more likely to trust the one with glowing reviews, even from strangers we'll never meet. This is why companies proudly display testimonials, ratings, and case studies. They know our brains are wired to take cues from others, even when we think we're making an independent choice. Social proof comes in different forms. Expert social proof occurs when professionals or specialists endorse something. Celebrity social proof leverages fame and influence to sway audiences. User social proof is based on reviews and feedback from ordinary people. There's also crowd social proof, which relies on sheer numbers, over 1 million sold, and peer social proof, where recommendations come from friends or people we personally know. Each type taps into the same basic instinct, the belief that others' actions are a reliable shortcut for making our own decisions. While social proof can be helpful in navigating a complex world, after all, it's impossible to research every choice in depth, it can also lead us astray. Trends, fads, and even dangerous behaviors can spread rapidly when everyone assumes the crowd must be right. Social media amplifies this effect by making popularity visible through likes, shares, and view counts, which can create a feedback loop where perceived popularity fuels actual popularity. This can give undeserving ideas, products, or people a level of credibility they haven't truly earned. The danger of social proof lies in its ability to override critical thinking. Just because a large group supports something doesn't mean it's correct, ethical, or beneficial. Herd mentality can lead to mass mistakes, from economic bubbles to public health risks to political movements, built on misinformation. The most notorious historical examples show that entire societies can be swayed in harmful directions when people stop questioning and simply follow the majority. To use social proof wisely, it's important to ask yourself, am I choosing this because I've verified its value or just because others seem to like it? Awareness of this bias doesn't mean ignoring the crowd entirely. Sometimes the majority really does know best, but it does mean taking a step back to separate genuine quality from popularity that might be manufactured. Social proof can be a powerful motivator for good, spreading beneficial ideas and encouraging positive change. But without awareness, it can also be a silent force pulling you in directions you never consciously chose. Mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect is the psychological phenomenon where the more we are exposed to something, the more we tend to like it. Even if our initial reaction was neutral or negative, it's the brain's way of associating familiarity with safety and comfort. From an evolutionary standpoint, this made sense. Things we encountered often without harm were likely safe, while completely unfamiliar things could be dangerous. In the modern world, this bias plays out in music, advertising, relationships, and even political campaigns, subtly shaping our preferences without us realizing it. Think about a song you didn't care for the first time you heard it. Maybe it was just okay or even slightly annoying, but after hearing it repeatedly on the radio or in playlists, you found yourself humming along, and eventually you genuinely liked it. That's the mere exposure effect at work. The same thing happens with brands that advertise heavily. Even if you've never used their product, constant exposure to their logo, slogan, or jingle creates a sense of trust and likability. Politicians rely on this too. The more you see their name and face, the more familiar and approachable they seem, which can increase votes. This effect extends to people as well. You might not feel a strong connection to someone at first, but after repeatedly seeing them in your class, office, or neighborhood, you begin to warm up to them. In romantic contexts, repeated interactions can foster attraction simply because the person becomes a familiar presence in your life. That's why proximity, being physically around someone more often plays a significant role in friendships and relationships forming. Research by psychologist Robert Zeigarnik in the 1960s provided clear evidence for the mere exposure effect. Participants were shown unfamiliar shapes, symbols, and even nonsense words multiple times. The more often they saw an item, the more positively they rated it, regardless of whether it had any inherent meaning or value. The same principle applies to nearly everything we encounter. Repeated exposure creates a subtle emotional bond. However, the mere exposure effect has limits. Overexposure can lead to boredom or even annoyance. A song played too many times can become irritating, and an advertisement shown excessively can cause backlash. Also, if the initial impression is strongly negative, repeated exposure may not improve feelings toward it and can even reinforce the dislike. Advertisers, marketers, and influencers use the mere exposure effect strategically by ensuring their message appears frequently across different platforms. That's why you might see the same brand on billboards, social media, TV commercials, and product placements. It's not about you analyzing their value. It's about you feeling a subtle connection just from familiarity. Understanding the mere exposure effect allows you to recognize when your preferences are being shaped by repetition rather than actual quality. While familiarity can be comforting, awareness ensures that you're liking something because it genuinely resonates with you, not just because you've seen it 100 times. Cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the mental discomfort we feel when our actions, beliefs, or values are in conflict with one another. It's that uneasy tension in your mind when you know you should be doing one thing, but you end up doing the opposite, or when you hold two contradictory beliefs at the same time. This discomfort pushes us to find a way to resolve the inconsistency, often by changing our attitudes, justifying our behavior, or ignoring the conflict altogether. Imagine someone who believes in healthy eating but regularly consumes fast food. Every time they order a burger and fries, a small voice in their head reminds them it goes against their health goals. That inner conflict is cognitive dissonance at work. To ease the discomfort, they might justify their choice by saying, "I had a stressful day, so I deserve this," or "one meal won't hurt." Instead of changing the behavior immediately, they adjust their thinking to make the action feel more acceptable. This phenomenon is everywhere in daily life. Smokers know the health risks, but often convince themselves it's not that bad, or that they'll quit later. People in unhealthy relationships might justify staying by focusing only on the good moments, even when they know the relationship is harmful. Consumers may buy expensive items they don't need, then rationalize the purchase as an investment to avoid feeling guilty. The theory of cognitive dissonance was first introduced by psychologist Leon Festinger in 1957. His research showed that people are highly motivated to reduce the discomfort caused by conflicting thoughts and behaviors. We do this by either changing our behavior, changing our beliefs, or selectively focusing on information that supports our current choices. This is why confirmation bias and self-justification often go hand in hand with cognitive dissonance. We seek out information that makes our decisions feel right, even when they're questionable. One classic experiment demonstrating this effect involved participants performing a boring task and then being paid either $1 or $20 to tell someone else it was enjoyable. Surprisingly, those paid only $1 were more likely to convince themselves the task was fun. Why? Because $1 wasn't enough to justify lying, so they changed their attitude to align with their words, reducing the dissonance. Cognitive dissonance isn't inherently bad. It can actually be a catalyst for growth and self-improvement. That discomfort can motivate us to align our actions with our values. For example, someone feeling guilty about not exercising might finally commit to a workout routine. The problem is when we repeatedly resolve dissonance by making excuses instead of making changes, which can trap us in unhealthy cycles. Recognizing cognitive dissonance in yourself is powerful. It allows you to step back and ask, am I justifying this because it's right for me, or because it's easier than changing? The more honestly you answer that question, the more likely you are to make decisions that truly reflect who you want to be. Pygmalion Effect. The Pygmalion Effect is the phenomenon where higher expectations lead to improved performance. When someone genuinely believes in another person's potential and communicates that belief, whether through words, tone, or actions, it can inspire that person to rise to meet those expectations. This is a form of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The expectation creates the conditions for its own success. The name comes from the Greek myth of Pygmalion, a sculptor who fell in love with a statue he carved. His unwavering belief in its beauty and perfection brought it to life. In psychology, it refers to the way belief can breathe life into someone's abilities. One of the most famous demonstrations of the Pygmalion Effect was a 1968 study by psychologists Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson. In an elementary school, teachers were told that certain students had scored unusually high on an intelligence test and were expected to show significant academic growth in the coming year. In reality, these students were chosen at random. By the end of the year, many of those students did in fact perform better, not because they were more capable from the start, but because their teachers treated them differently, gave them more encouragement, and showed more patience and confidence in their abilities. This effect doesn't only apply to classrooms. In workplaces, managers who expect great results from their teams often get them because they provide more resources, feedback, and trust. In sports, coaches who believe in an athlete's potential tend to give them more opportunities to improve, leading to better performance. Even in personal relationships, when a friend or partner expects the best from you, it can boost your motivation and confidence to live up to that image. The power of the Pygmalion Effect lies in subtle behaviors. People who believe in your potential often smile more, give you more constructive feedback, provide extra guidance, and show genuine interest in your progress. These micro-interactions create an environment where you feel supported and capable, which fuels your own belief in yourself. That self-belief, in turn, influences your actions, creating a cycle of improvement. However, the reverse is also true. Low expectations can limit potential. If someone in a position of influence assumes you won't succeed, they may unconsciously give you less attention, fewer challenges, and less encouragement, which can hold you back. This is closely related to the Golem Effect, where negative expectations lead to poorer performance. The Pygmalion Effect is a reminder that belief is contagious. When leaders, teachers, parents, or peers hold positive expectations, they often help shape reality in that direction. The way we view others and the way we communicate those views can be the spark that ignites untapped potential. In many cases, the first step towards someone's success is simply someone else believing they can succeed. Golem Effect. The Golem Effect is the opposite of the Pygmalion Effect. It occurs when low expectations placed on a person lead to poorer performance. Just as high expectations can inspire growth, low expectations can quietly undermine confidence, motivation, and ability. When someone in a position of influence, a teacher, boss, coach, or even a parent, assumes you won't succeed, they may, often without realizing it, behave in ways that hold you back. Over time, you start to internalize these beliefs, and your performance suffers, not because you lack potential, but because the environment around you has convinced you you're incapable. This effect often begins subtly. A manager who doubts an employee's ability might give them fewer responsibilities, less challenging work, or minimal feedback. A teacher who assumes a student will struggle may call on them less in class, offer less guidance, or avoid pushing them toward higher goals. Even small cues like body language, tone of voice, or lack of enthusiasm can send the message, "I don't think you can do it." Over time, the person on the receiving end starts to believe it themselves, leading to lower effort and diminished results. Psychologists have found that the Golem Effect often operates unconsciously. The person with the low expectations may not intend to be discouraging. They might even believe they're being realistic. But because expectations shape the way we interact with others, these hidden signals influence behavior in powerful ways. When someone feels that those around them don't believe in them, they may stop believing in themselves, and that lack of belief directly impacts performance. In educational settings, the Golem Effect can be especially damaging. If a student senses that a teacher expects them to fail, they may become disengaged, stop participating, and avoid taking risks in their learning. In the workplace, employees who feel underestimated may withdraw effort, avoid seeking advancement, and settle for mediocrity, reinforcing the negative perception. In sports, athletes who feel their coach has written them off may lose the drive to train hard or compete at their best. The tragedy of the Golem Effect is that it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Low expectations lead to reduced opportunities and support, which cause performance to drop, which then proves the original assumption correct. Breaking this cycle requires awareness from both sides. Those in positions of influence must consciously avoid sending signals of doubt, and individuals who feel underestimated must work to reject those limiting beliefs. Understanding the Golem Effect is vital for leaders, educators, and anyone who guides others. Even unspoken expectations can shape outcomes, and underestimating someone may cause more harm than overt criticism. By replacing doubt with encouragement and focusing on potential rather than limitations, it's possible to prevent the Golem Effect from taking hold and to give people the chance to rise to their true capabilities. Spotlight Effect. The spotlight effect is the tendency to believe that other people are noticing and judging us far more than they actually are. It's a cognitive bias that makes us feel like we're under constant observation, as if a spotlight is shining directly on us in every social situation. In reality, most people are far more focused on themselves than they are on anyone else. Yet when we make a mistake, feel self-conscious about our appearance, or say something awkward, we often assume it's the only thing everyone around us can think about. This phenomenon can be traced to how our minds process our own experiences. Since we are at the center of our own world, it's easy to overestimate how much space we occupy in the thoughts of others. Psychologists Thomas Gilovich and Kenneth Savitsky studied this bias. By asking participants to wear a t-shirt with an embarrassing image and then guess how many people noticed it, the participants assumed about half of the people would notice. In reality, only about 20% did. The finding was clear. We dramatically overestimate how much attention we attract. The spotlight effect can affect all areas of life. Students might avoid speaking up in class for fear of saying something stupid, believing everyone will remember it, when in fact most classmates won't recall it moments later. Someone with a stain on their shirt might feel humiliated, convinced that everyone in the room has seen it, even though most people never notice. Public speaking anxiety often stems from this same bias, the belief that every movement, word, and facial expression is being scrutinized when the audience is usually just waiting to hear the message. While the spotlight effect is often a source of anxiety, it also has a freeing truth at its core. People are simply not paying as much attention to you as you think. Most individuals are preoccupied with their own concerns, appearances, and problems. Recognizing this can reduce social anxiety, boost confidence, and encourage people to take risks they might otherwise avoid. Ironically, being aware of the spotlight effect can help you shift your perspective in a way that makes you less self-conscious. The next time you feel like all eyes are on you, remind yourself that most people won't notice, and those who do will likely forget quickly. This doesn't mean you should ignore social norms or stop caring about how you present yourself, but it does mean you can give yourself permission to be imperfect, without fearing the world will remember every misstep. Ultimately, the spotlight effect reminds us that the world is not watching as closely as we imagine. That realization can be liberating, because once you stop assuming you're under constant judgment, you can focus less on self-consciousness and more on living authentically. Pratfall Effect. The Pratfall Effect is the curious psychological phenomenon where making small mistakes or showing minor flaws can actually make a person seem more likable, relatable, and human, as long as they are generally perceived as competent. When someone who is skilled, confident, or admired slips up in a harmless way, it often softens their image, making them appear more approachable. Instead of damaging their reputation, the imperfection adds warmth and authenticity. This effect was first demonstrated in the 1960s by psychologist Elliot Aronson. In his study, participants listened to recordings of people answering quiz questions. Some contestants performed flawlessly, while others made a few mistakes. Then, in certain versions of the recording, the contestants spilled coffee on themselves. Surprisingly, the highly competent individuals who made this small blunder were rated as more likable than those who remained perfect. The mistake made them feel more real and less intimidating. However, for participants who were already perceived as average or incompetent, the blunder had the opposite effect. It lowered their likability even further. You can see the pratfall effect at work in everyday life. A public speaker who stumbles over a word and laughs it off may win the audience's affection. A leader who admits to a small oversight might earn more trust than one who insists on projecting flawless authority. Even celebrities and influencers sometimes strategically share embarrassing stories or behind-the-scenes mishaps to connect with their audience. These moments of imperfection signal that no matter how talented or accomplished someone is, they're still human, and that makes them easier to relate to. The pratfall effect works because perfection can create distance. People who appear flawless may be admired, but they can also feel unapproachable or intimidating. When they reveal a harmless flaw, it bridges the gap between them and others, creating a sense of shared humanity. The key, however, is balance. The mistake must be small and inconsequential. Serious errors or repeated incompetence don't trigger the pratfall effect. They simply undermine credibility. In leadership, teaching, or any role that involves influencing others, the pratfall effect can be a subtle but powerful tool. Showing vulnerability or admitting to a minor mistake can build rapport and trust as long as it's clear you're still capable and knowledgeable. It signals humility without sacrificing competence. Ultimately, The Pratfall Effect is a reminder that perfection isn't always the most attractive trait. Sometimes it's the little flaws, the coffee spill, the wrong turn, the laugh at your own mistake, that make others feel closer to you. Being real can often win more hearts than being perfect. Fear of missing out, FOMO. The fear of missing out, commonly known as FOMO, is the anxious feeling that you're being left out of rewarding experiences happening elsewhere. It's that restless urge to stay constantly connected, to check what others are doing, and to make sure you're not missing an opportunity for fun, success, or connection. While the term became popular in the age of social media, the underlying emotion is deeply human. It stems from our evolutionary need to belong to a group and to stay aware of opportunities that could ensure our survival. In modern life, FOMO often takes the form of scrolling through social media and seeing friends at parties, colleagues landing promotions, or influencers traveling to exotic locations. Even if you were content with your day before, those images can trigger an uneasy sense that your life is lacking something. This feeling can push people to overcommit, attend events they don't actually enjoy, or constantly refresh their feeds in search of something better. The fear isn't just about missing fun. It's about the possibility that others are living a more fulfilling or successful life than you are. Psychologists link FOMO to both social comparison and the brain's reward system. When you see others engaging in exciting activities, your brain perceives it as a signal that you might be falling behind in status or opportunity. This triggers a desire to catch up or stay involved, even if it means stretching yourself thin. The constant stream of curated highlight reel content online amplifies this feeling, making it seem as though everyone else is always having a better time. While a little bit of FOMO can motivate us to try new things and stay socially engaged, too much can harm mental well-being. Studies have found that high levels of FOMO are linked to increased anxiety, stress, and feelings of inadequacy. It can also lead to burnout from trying to do everything, and ironically, it can cause you to enjoy experiences less because you're distracted by wondering what else you could be doing. One effective way to counter FOMO is to practice JOMO, the joy of missing out. This mindset shift involves consciously appreciating the value of what you are doing in the present moment, rather than worrying about what you might be missing. Setting boundaries with technology, limiting social media use, and focusing on activities that genuinely bring you satisfaction can help you escape the constant cycle of comparison. At its core, FOMO is a reminder that our minds are easily pulled toward what we don't have, rather than what we do. By recognizing when that fear is driving your choices, you can choose to engage in life on your own terms, not out of anxiety about missing out, but from a genuine desire to be where you truly want to be. Hedonic Treadmill. The hedonic treadmill, also known as hedonic adaptation, is the psychological phenomenon where people quickly return to a relatively stable level of happiness despite major positive or negative events in their lives. In other words, no matter how much we achieve, acquire, or experience, the boost in happiness we feel is usually temporary, and we soon find ourselves back at our baseline. It's like running on a treadmill. You feel like you're moving forward, but in reality, you're staying in the same place emotionally. At first, this idea might seem discouraging. After all, many of us believe that reaching a big milestone, buying a dream home, landing a promotion, getting into a relationship, will lead to lasting happiness. And in the short term, it often does. But over time, we adapt to our new reality, and the excitement fades. That same house becomes just the place we live. That promotion becomes just the job, and we begin to focus on the next thing we want. The cycle repeats: desire, achievement, adaptation, desire again. This effect also works with negative experiences. Losing a job, going through a breakup, or facing a setback can significantly lower happiness for a time, but most people eventually return to their previous emotional baseline. Psychologists believe this adaptation is partly due to our survival instincts. Being able to move on from both joy and pain allowed our ancestors to stay focused on ongoing challenges rather than getting stuck in one emotional state. The hedonic treadmill plays a major role in consumer behavior. Advertisers and marketers thrive on our tendency to quickly grow used to what we have, encouraging us to buy the next new thing to chase that fleeting high. Social comparison amplifies the effect. Once we adapt to our own gains, we often measure them against others, creating a constant desire for more or better. Breaking free from the hedonic treadmill doesn't mean giving up on goals or pleasures. It means recognizing that external achievements alone can't create lasting happiness. Research suggests that focusing on gratitude, building meaningful relationships, and engaging in purposeful activities can raise our baseline of well-being in more sustainable ways. Instead of constantly chasing the next source of happiness, we can learn to savor what we already have and find joy in the process rather than the destination. The hedonic treadmill reminds us that while change and progress are part of life, true contentment comes from within. Without that awareness, we risk running endlessly toward a happiness that always seems just out of reach, when it might already be right under our feet. Loss aversion. Loss aversion is the psychological tendency to feel the pain of losing something more strongly than the pleasure of gaining something of equal value. In other words, losing $100 hurts far more than winning $100 feels good. This bias is deeply rooted in human evolution. For our ancestors, losses could mean the difference between survival and death. So our brains became wired to avoid them at all costs. In modern life, that survival instinct still drives many of our decisions, even in situations where the stakes aren't truly life or death. Psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, pioneers of behavioral economics, studied loss aversion extensively. They found that people are typically about twice as sensitive to losses as they are to gains. This means that when making choices, we're more motivated to avoid losing than we are to pursue winning. For example, if an investment carries the same chance of earning money as losing it, most people will reject it, even if the potential gain is equal to or slightly greater than the potential loss. Loss aversion can influence everything from financial decisions to personal relationships. Investors often hold on to losing stocks longer than they should, hoping to avoid locking in the loss, even when selling would be the smarter move. In sports, teams sometimes play overly cautiously when ahead, fearing a loss more than seeking a bigger lead. In negotiations, people may reject fair deals simply because they perceive giving something up as too costly, even when they stand to benefit overall. Marketers use loss aversion to their advantage through tactics like limited time offers, only 3 left in stock, and trial periods that make you feel you'll lose access to a benefit if you don't act quickly. Subscription services often offer free trials because they know that once you've had access, the idea of losing it makes you more likely to continue paying. While loss aversion can protect us from unnecessary risks, it can also hold us back. Fear of loss may prevent us from taking opportunities, making changes, or investing in ourselves. In relationships, it can cause people to stay in unfulfilling situations simply because they fear losing the comfort of what they know. The key to overcoming loss aversion is to consciously weigh decisions based on the true long-term outcomes, rather than the immediate emotional sting of loss. By reframing risks and focusing on potential gains, we can make choices that serve us better over time. Loss aversion shows that our decisions aren't always rational. They're shaped by deep emotional wiring. Understanding this bias allows us to step back, see the bigger picture, and make choices that aren't driven solely by the fear of losing something. Endowment Effect. The endowment effect is the psychological bias that makes us value something more highly, simply because we own it. Once something is ours, whether it's a house, a car, a piece of clothing, or even an idea, we tend to assign it greater worth than we would if we didn't own it. This happens even if the item hasn't changed in any objective way. The emotional attachment we form once we take possession can make us reluctant to part with it, even when doing so would be rational or beneficial. This phenomenon was first identified by behavioral economist Richard Thaler, and it's closely related to loss aversion. Giving something up feels like a loss, and because losses hurt more than gains feel good, we become overly protective of what we own. For example, if you were given a coffee mug and asked to sell it, you'd likely demand a higher price than you'd be willing to pay for the exact same mug if you didn't own it. Studies repeatedly show this gap between the price owners demand and the price buyers are willing to pay. The endowment effect appears in many areas of life. Homeowners often overvalue their houses because of personal memories and the effort they've invested, leading them to reject fair market offers. People hold on to clothes they never wear, gadgets they don't use, or books they'll never read, simply because they feel a sense of ownership. Even ideas and beliefs are subject to this bias. Once we've embraced a particular opinion, we're more resistant to changing it, because it feels like giving up something we own mentally. Marketers and salespeople know how to trigger the endowment effect. Free trials, test drives, and try before you buy offers work, because once you've experienced ownership, even temporarily, the thought of giving it up feels like losing something valuable. Subscription services also use this tactic, knowing that after you've grown accustomed to their product or service, you'll feel reluctant to cancel it. While the endowment effect can make us appreciate what we have, it can also cloud our judgment. It can cause us to overprice items we're selling, refuse to let go of things we no longer need, or hold on to outdated ideas simply because they're ours. Recognizing this bias helps us step back and evaluate things more objectively, asking, would I want this if I didn't already have it? Ultimately, the endowment effect shows how our sense of ownership can alter our perception of value. By being aware of it, we can make clearer, more rational decisions and avoid holding on to things simply because we already call them ours. Dunning-Kruger Effect. The Dunning-Kruger Effect is a cognitive bias in which people with low ability, knowledge, or experience in a particular area tend to overestimate their competence. At the same time, highly skilled individuals may underestimate their abilities, assuming that what comes easily to them must also be easy for others. This creates a paradox where the least competent often feel the most confident, while the most competent may doubt themselves. The effect was first identified in 1999 by psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger, who conducted experiments showing that people who performed poorly on tests of logic, grammar, and humor tended to overestimate their performance. The reason: a lack of skill not only leads to mistakes, but also limits the ability to recognize those mistakes. Essentially, you need a certain level of knowledge to accurately assess your own knowledge, and without it, you're more likely to have blind spots about your weaknesses. The Dunning-Kruger effect appears in many areas of life. In workplaces, inexperienced employees might take on complex tasks with unwarranted confidence, underestimating the challenges involved. In debates, people with only surface-level understanding may argue with great certainty, while experts, aware of the complexity, speak more cautiously. On social media, it's common to see individuals passionately sharing oversimplified opinions on topics they barely understand, convinced they've grasped the full picture. This bias is not about intelligence, it's about self-awareness. Even highly intelligent people can fall into it if they're working in a field where they lack experience. Similarly, being skilled in one area doesn't guarantee accurate self-assessment in another. The flip side is also important. Highly competent individuals often experience the imposter syndrome effect, believing they're less capable than they are because they assume others have the same knowledge or skill. One of the best ways to counter the Dunning-Kruger effect is through continuous learning and feedback. Exposure to more information, experience, and constructive criticism helps reveal the limits of our understanding. This humility allows us to approach problems with more accuracy and less overconfidence. For experts, recognizing their own competence can help them avoid unnecessary self-doubt. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a reminder that confidence and competence are not always aligned. True skill often comes with an awareness of complexity, and the more you know, the more you realize how much there is left to learn. False consensus effect. The false consensus effect is a cognitive bias that leads people to overestimate how much others share their beliefs, values, preferences, or behaviors. In other words, we assume that our own way of thinking is far more common than it actually is. This happens because we naturally view our personal perspective as normal, and we tend to surround ourselves with people who think and act like us, reinforcing the illusion that our views are widely held. This bias can play out in countless ways. If you dislike a certain type of food, you might assume most people feel the same way. If you support a particular political stance, you may believe it's the majority opinion simply because everyone in your social circle agrees with you. Online spaces intensify this effect. Algorithms often feed us content that aligns with our existing beliefs, creating an echo chamber that makes our views seem even more universal. The false consensus effect is not just about beliefs, it also applies to behavior. People who engage in certain habits, whether healthy or unhealthy, often assume those habits are common. For example, someone who exercises daily might think most people work out regularly, while someone who smokes might assume everyone smokes occasionally. In both cases, personal experience shapes perceived reality, regardless of the actual data. Psychologists believe this bias is partly driven by a desire for social validation. Believing that others agree with us makes us feel more confident and secure in our choices. It also reduces cognitive dissonance. If our opinions and actions are widely shared, they must be reasonable, right? Unfortunately, this thinking can lead to misunderstandings, poor decision-making, and an inability to appreciate different perspectives. The false consensus effect can create problems in group settings. Leaders who assume everyone agrees with them may ignore valuable dissenting opinions. Marketers who believe everyone will want this product might misjudge their audience and fail. On a personal level, it can strain relationships when we expect others to think or act as we do, only to discover they see things differently. One way to reduce this bias is to actively seek out diverse perspectives. Talking to people from different backgrounds, reading viewpoints you disagree with, and checking your assumptions against real data can help you see beyond your personal bubble. The false consensus effect is a powerful reminder that our personal experience is not the whole picture. Just because something feels normal to us doesn't mean it's the norm for everyone, and recognizing that gap is key to better understanding the world around us. Just world hypothesis. The just world hypothesis is the belief that the world is fundamentally fair, that people get what they deserve and deserve what they get. According to this view, good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. While this belief can provide comfort and a sense of order, it can also distort reality, leading to unfair judgments about others and a lack of empathy for those facing hardship. This idea was first studied in the 1960s by social psychologist Melvin Lerner, who noticed that people often react to others' suffering by assuming the victims must have done something to bring it upon themselves. In experiments, participants who saw someone experiencing misfortune were more likely to rationalize it by thinking the person must have behaved badly or made poor choices, rather than accepting that bad things can happen to anyone. This was a way to preserve their belief in a predictable, just world. The just world hypothesis can subtly shape our thinking in everyday life. When we hear about someone losing their job, getting sick, or being a victim of crime, we might unconsciously search for a reason that blames them. They should have taken better care of themselves, or they must have been irresponsible with money. By assuming there's always a cause tied to the person's own actions, how we shield ourselves from the uncomfortable truth that similar misfortune could happen to us, even if we've done nothing wrong. While this belief can be motivating, encouraging people to work hard and live morally, it becomes harmful when it leads to victim blaming or indifference. For example, survivors of assault may face the cruel question, "What were you wearing?" Or poor individuals may be judged as lazy without considering systemic issues that limit opportunities. In these cases, the just world belief acts as a psychological defense mechanism for the observer, not an accurate reflection of reality. This bias also works in reverse. Assuming good fortune always comes from merit can lead us to overlook luck, privilege, or external help. Someone who inherits wealth may be seen as deserving their success simply because they have it, while others who work just as hard but lack those advantages are seen as less worthy. Recognizing the just world hypothesis in ourselves is important because it helps us approach others with more compassion and fairness. Life is not a perfectly balanced scale, and circumstances don't always match effort or morality. Understanding this can make us less judgmental, more empathetic, and more willing to address the inequalities that truly exist. Placebo effect. The placebo effect is a fascinating psychological and physiological phenomenon in which a person experiences real improvements in their condition after receiving a treatment with no active therapeutic ingredients, simply because they believe the treatment will work. In other words, the expectation of healing can trigger actual changes in the body and mind, even if the medicine is nothing more than a sugar pill, saline injection, or sham procedure. Researchers have long been aware of the mind's ability to influence the body, but the placebo effect became a central topic in medical science when studies began revealing its measurable impact. In clinical trials, patients given a placebo often report reduced pain, improved mood, or relief from symptoms, despite receiving no active drug. Brain imaging studies have shown that placebos can stimulate the release of endorphins, dopamine, and other chemicals associated with real medical benefits. The placebo effect is not all in the mind. It can produce genuine, measurable effects. For example, patients with pain conditions may experience reduced discomfort, and people with depression may notice mood improvements purely due to the brain's self-healing capabilities. However, it's not a cure-all, and it typically works best for symptoms that are influenced by perception, such as pain, fatigue, or anxiety, rather than for conditions requiring direct physical intervention, like infections or broken bones. Ethically, the placebo effect has been a subject of debate in medicine. While it can provide real benefits, giving someone a treatment with no active ingredient without their knowledge raises questions about deception and informed consent. Some modern research explores open-label placebos, where patients are told they are receiving a placebo, and yet still experience improvement, showing how powerful the brain's belief systems can be. The placebo effect is a powerful reminder of the mind-body connection. It demonstrates that belief and expectation can influence health in profound ways, and that healing is not just about chemistry, it's also about psychology. By understanding and harnessing this effect ethically, healthcare can tap into one of the most remarkable resources we already possess, the healing potential of our own minds. Nocebo Effect. The nocebo effect is the darker counterpart to the placebo effect. Instead of positive expectations leading to beneficial outcomes, negative expectations lead to worse outcomes or the onset of harmful symptoms. In simple terms, if you believe a treatment, substance, or situation will cause you harm, your body and mind can respond in ways that make that harm feel real, even if the trigger itself is harmless. This phenomenon has been documented in medical research and everyday life. For example, patients who are warned extensively about a drug's potential side effects are more likely to experience those side effects even when given a harmless pill. In one striking study, participants told that a mild electrical stimulus might be painful reported discomfort or even pain, despite no painful current being delivered. The expectation of harm alone was enough to create the sensation. The nocebo effect works through several psychological and physiological mechanisms. Anticipating harm can heighten anxiety and activate stress responses in the body, such as increased cortisol levels, muscle tension, and changes in heart rate. These changes can, in turn, amplify physical sensations, making them more noticeable and distressing. Just as the placebo effect can release endorphins and other feel-good chemicals, the nocebo effect can trigger processes that intensify pain, discomfort, or illness-like symptoms. This effect often appears in public health scares, misinformation campaigns, or mass psychogenic illness, where groups of people develop symptoms simply because they believe they have been exposed to a harmful substance. Media reports, social media posts, or warnings without proper context can unintentionally fuel these reactions. The nocebo effect is particularly challenging in healthcare. Doctors have an ethical obligation to inform patients about possible risks, but delivering this information in a way that minimizes unnecessary fear is a delicate balance. The way side effects are framed can make a big difference. For instance, saying 90% of patients experience no problems tends to cause fewer nocebo-related symptoms than saying 10% of patients experience side effects, even though the statistics are identical. Understanding the nocebo effect is important because it shows how our beliefs and expectations can directly influence our health, for better or worse. While the placebo effect harnesses the mind's power to heal, the Nocebo Effect reveals how the same power can create or worsen suffering. By being aware of it, both patients and healthcare providers can work toward communicating risks responsibly and reducing unnecessary psychological harm. Ostrich Effect. The Ostrich Effect is a behavioral bias where people deliberately avoid information that they fear might be unpleasant or distressing, much like the mythical idea of an ostrich burying its head in the sand to avoid danger. Instead of facing a potential problem head-on, we sometimes choose to look away, convincing ourselves that if we don't acknowledge it, it might not be real or might somehow go away on its own. This avoidance can take many forms. Investors might refuse to check their portfolios during a market downturn because they don't want to confront financial losses. Someone with health concerns may delay medical checkups to avoid bad news. Even in everyday life, people may ignore bills, unread emails, or important decisions because dealing with them feels overwhelming or anxiety-inducing. In the short term, this avoidance can bring temporary relief, but in the long term it often makes the problem worse. Psychologists link the ostrich effect to emotional coping mechanisms. When information threatens our sense of security, control, or well-being, our brains sometimes choose short-term emotional comfort over long-term rational decision-making. The act of not knowing gives us a false sense of safety, even if the situation itself hasn't improved. This bias also ties into loss aversion. We fear the emotional pain of confronting potential losses, so we choose to stay in the dark. In finance, the ostrich effect is well documented. Studies show that people are more likely to check their investment accounts when the market is up and less likely when it's down. In health, avoiding screenings or test results can delay treatment for conditions that could have been addressed more effectively if caught early. In relationships, ignoring uncomfortable conversations can allow resentment or misunderstandings to grow unchecked. While the ostrich effect is understandable, after all, facing bad news is emotionally difficult. It can be harmful if left unchecked. The best way to counter it is to reframe the act of seeking information as an act of empowerment rather than one of fear. Knowing the reality of a situation gives you the ability to make informed choices and take proactive steps toward improvement. Ultimately, the ostrich effect shows how the human mind often prioritizes emotional comfort over objective truth. But burying your head in the sand doesn't make danger disappear. It only blinds you to it. By confronting reality, even when it's uncomfortable, you open the door to solutions instead of letting problems grow in the dark. Hindsight bias. Hindsight bias, often called the "I knew it all along" effect, is the tendency to believe after an event has occurred that we predicted or expected the outcome, even when we had no clear way of knowing it beforehand. This bias alters our memory of what we thought in the past, making our judgments seem more accurate than they really were and giving us a false sense of foresight. This phenomenon is common in everyday life. After a sports team wins, fans might say they always knew that team would win, even though before the game the outcome was uncertain. In investing, people often look back on market trends and claim they saw the rise or fall coming, despite the fact that their predictions were vague or contradictory beforehand. Even in relationships, someone might recall seeing the red flags all along after a breakup, when in reality, they didn't interpret those signs the same way at the time. Psychologists believe hindsight bias occurs because our brains are constantly trying to make sense of the world by creating a coherent narrative. Once we know the outcome, our memory reconstructs past events to fit that outcome, smoothing over uncertainty and making events feel more predictable. This can give us confidence in our decision-making abilities, but it can also distort reality, leading us to overestimate our ability to predict future events. Hindsight bias can be harmful in certain contexts. In law, jurors might judge a defendant's decisions more harshly if they know the harmful outcome, assuming they should have foreseen it. In business, leaders might underestimate the complexity of challenges because they now see past successes as inevitable. In personal growth, it can prevent us from accurately learning from mistakes because we rewrite our memory of how we approached a decision in the first place. One way to combat hindsight bias is to keep detailed records of your thoughts and predictions before an outcome is known. This paper trail helps reveal what you actually believed at the time, making it harder to rewrite history in your mind. Acknowledging uncertainty and the role of chance also helps maintain a realistic perspective. Hindsight bias reminds us that memory isn't a perfect record. It's a story we rewrite with each retelling. By being aware of this mental trap, we can avoid overconfidence, learn more honestly from experience, and better appreciate the unpredictability of life. The IKEA Effect. The IKEA Effect refers to a psychological phenomenon where people assign greater value to things they have put effort into creating themselves, even if the final product is not objectively better than alternatives. This bias is named after the Swedish furniture company IKEA, famous for selling flat-pack furniture that customers assemble on their own. Studies showed that people are often willing to pay more and feel a stronger emotional attachment to furniture they have built themselves compared to identical pieces that come pre-assembled. The reason behind this is that the extra effort and time invested in building the item create a sense of personal ownership and pride, making it feel more valuable. But the IKEA effect is not limited to just furniture. It applies broadly to any situation where a person invests effort or labor into making something. For example, a homemade meal is often perceived as tastier and more satisfying than a restaurant dish, even if the ingredients and recipe are identical. Similarly, a project that someone has spent hours developing tends to feel more impressive and meaningful to them than one they simply outsourced or bought. Even businesses that entrepreneurs build from the ground up often feel more valuable and rewarding than ones they inherit or acquire with less personal input. This effect happens because human psychology strongly ties effort to ownership and value. When people spend time, energy, and labor on something, they form a deeper personal connection with it, which colors their perception of its worth. They don't just value the end result. They value their own role and contribution in bringing it to life. Companies have learned to leverage this bias by offering customizable products, build-your-own meal kits, and DIY experiences that encourage customers to engage actively in the creation process. By involving people directly, these companies increase customer satisfaction and the perceived value of their products, even if a professional could produce a better or faster result. However, the IKEA effect also has some downsides. Because people grow emotionally attached to what they create, they may overestimate the quality or value of their work and become resistant to constructive criticism. Authors, designers, or inventors who pour effort into their creations sometimes struggle to accept feedback or acknowledge flaws because their investment blinds them to imperfections. This bias can also lead to stubbornness, causing people to continue pursuing ideas or projects that may no longer be viable simply because they've already invested a significant amount of time and effort into them. To balance the IKEA effect, it is important to recognize that effort does not always equal quality or value. Just because something took a long time to make does not necessarily mean it is superior. Being open to outside perspectives and constructive feedback can help people avoid over-attachment and make clearer, more rational decisions. Both the IKEA effect and related biases, like hindsight bias, reveal how our perceptions can be distorted by our own involvement in events. Hindsight bias makes us believe we predicted outcomes better than we actually did, while the IKEA effect makes us overvalue things we've personally built or worked on. Understanding these biases fosters better self-awareness, sharper decision-making, and a more realistic view of the world. The curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge is a cognitive bias that makes it extremely difficult for someone who knows something well to imagine what it's like not to know it. Once you have acquired knowledge or expertise, it becomes almost impossible to put yourself in the shoes of a complete beginner. This mental blind spot explains why teachers sometimes struggle to explain complex topics in simple ways, why experienced professionals assume certain ideas are obvious, and why people often overestimate how much others understand their thoughts or instructions. The curse of knowledge happens because learning actually rewires the brain. Once you understand something deeply, the neural pathways involved become automatic and natural, making the knowledge feel obvious to you. But because you cannot unlearn what you know, it's difficult to appreciate how confusing or unfamiliar that information might be to someone without your background. A classic demonstration of this effect was shown in a 1990 experiment by Elizabeth Newton. In the study, participants were asked to tap out the rhythm of a well-known song with their fingers, while other participants tried to guess the song based only on the tapping. The tappers believed the song was obvious and predicted listeners would guess correctly about half the time. In reality, the listeners only guessed correctly 2.5% of the time. The reason? The tappers could hear the melody in their heads as they tapped, but the listeners only heard random tapping sounds. This illustrates perfectly how once you know something, like the tune of a song, it's incredibly hard to imagine not knowing it, causing a huge gap in communication. The curse of knowledge creates misunderstandings and communication breakdowns in many areas of life. Teachers may explain subjects in ways that make perfect sense to them, but leave their students confused. Experts in fields ranging from medicine and finance to technology often assume that basic terms and concepts are obvious, which alienates and frustrates non-experts. Even in personal relationships, someone deeply familiar with a problem might find it difficult to clearly explain it to a friend or partner who lacks that same understanding. This bias also impacts leadership and teamwork. Managers sometimes assume that employees fully grasp instructions or goals, which can lead to frustration when tasks are incomplete or done incorrectly. Programmers might struggle to explain complex code to non-technical co-workers, and marketers might fail to connect with customers if they assume too much familiarity with a product or service. Overcoming the curse of knowledge requires empathy and conscious effort. Instead of assuming others know what you know, it helps to take a step back and imagine how confusing or new the information might seem to a beginner. Simplifying language, using analogies, and regularly checking for understanding can bridge the communication gap. Great communicators recognize that what feels obvious to them is not necessarily obvious to others, and they adjust their explanations accordingly. Developing this awareness improves teaching, teamwork, leadership, and everyday conversations by making them clearer and more inclusive. The serial position effect. The serial position effect is a cognitive bias that influences how people remember information when given a list of items. Specifically, it describes the tendency to recall the first and last items in a list much better than those in the middle. This effect is divided into two main components, the primacy effect and the recency effect. The primacy effect explains why people tend to remember the first few items in a list more clearly. Since those items appear at the beginning, they receive more attention and are more likely to be transferred into long-term memory. On the other hand, the recency effect refers to the better recall of the last few items in a list because they remain fresh in short-term memory at the time of recall. A simple everyday example of this bias is trying to memorize a grocery list. If someone reads the list aloud quickly, you are far more likely to remember the first few items because they received your initial attention, and the last few items because they are the most recent. However, the items in the middle of the list are more easily forgotten because they don't benefit from either the primacy or recency effects and thus receive less cognitive focus. The serial position effect has important implications across many fields, including marketing, education, and public speaking. Advertisers often place the most important messages or calls to action at the beginning and end of commercials. Knowing these parts are more likely to stick in viewers' minds. Teachers carefully structure lessons to introduce key takeaways early and reinforce them at the end to maximize retention. Public speakers and politicians craft speeches so that their strongest points come first and last, making those messages more memorable for their audience. Even in job interviews, the serial position effect plays a subtle but impactful role. Interviewers tend to remember the first and last candidates more vividly than those interviewed in the middle. This is why making a strong first impression and leaving a lasting final impression are both critical for success. This bias also extends to how people recall significant life events. Research shows that when people think back on vacations, they tend to remember the exciting beginning and the satisfying or disappointing end more clearly, while the middle portion often becomes a blur. Similarly, when reflecting on relationships, individuals may focus on the thrilling early days and the final breakup, but overlook the many everyday moments in between. To use the serial position effect to your advantage, it's important to strategically structure important information. When writing, presenting, or making requests, place your strongest points at the beginning and end to increase their impact and memorability. If you need to memorize information, give extra attention to reinforcing the middle items, since that is where memory naturally weakens. Understanding the serial position effect, alongside biases like the curse of knowledge, sheds light on how our brains process and retain information in ways that shape communication and memory. While the curse of knowledge makes it difficult to explain things clearly because it's hard to imagine what it's like not to know something, the serial position effect highlights how certain moments naturally stand out more than others. Recognizing these effects can improve teaching, learning, public speaking, and everyday interactions by making communication clearer, more effective, and more memorable. The frequency illusion. The frequency illusion is a fascinating cognitive bias that happens when you learn about something new or become aware of a particular idea, and suddenly it seems to appear everywhere. You might learn a new word, and all of a sudden, you hear it all around you, in conversations, on TV, or online. Or you start researching a specific car model, and suddenly you see it parked on every street you pass. Perhaps you discover a new concept or trend, and it begins popping up repeatedly in books, social media, and discussions. This experience is known as the frequency illusion, where your brain starts noticing something much more often, making it feel like it has suddenly become more common, even though it was always present. The change is not in the world itself, but in your perception. This effect is caused by two key mental processes: selective attention and confirmation bias. Selective attention acts like a filter in your brain, screening out irrelevant information and bringing relevant things to your focus. When you've recently learned about or become interested in a certain topic, your brain subconsciously scans the environment for it and highlights those instances. Confirmation bias then strengthens this effect by causing you to interpret these frequent sightings as evidence that the thing has truly become more prevalent or important, even though you're merely noticing it more than before. The frequency illusion isn't about an actual increase in how often something occurs. Rather, it's your perception that changes. That new slang word you picked up. People have been using it all along, but your brain simply wasn't paying attention. The book that seems to be everywhere now. It was always popular, but now it stands out more to you. The repeated number sequence or symbol you keep seeing. Your mind filters out countless other stimuli and focuses only on what seems relevant or significant. Marketers and advertisers frequently exploit the frequency illusion to their advantage. Once you see an advertisement for a product, your brain begins to notice it everywhere. On social media, feeds, in stores, even in casual conversations. It feels as if everyone is suddenly talking about it, which makes you more likely to believe that the product is trending or highly popular. Similarly, political campaigns use this strategy to highlight certain issues, so people start spotting evidence of those issues all around them, even if nothing has actually changed in the broader world. The frequency illusion also influences personal beliefs and attitudes. If someone believes that people around them are rude, they will start noticing every instance of rudeness, reinforcing their negative worldview. Conversely, if someone believes that opportunities are abundant, they tend to spot more chances and possibilities, even if the actual number of opportunities hasn't increased. This phenomenon demonstrates how your focus and attention shape your reality. What you pay attention to becomes more visible, even if the external world remains the same. Understanding the frequency illusion is important because it helps prevent false assumptions about reality. Instead of automatically assuming something has suddenly become more common or popular, it's valuable to pause and ask yourself, has this truly increased, or am I just noticing it more? This awareness encourages critical thinking, helping you avoid overestimating trends, coincidences, or the prevalence of certain ideas. By recognizing this bias, you can better navigate the flood of information in today's world and make clearer, more balanced judgments. The McGurk Effect. The McGurk Effect is a fascinating phenomenon where what you see can completely change what you hear. It's a mind-bending illusion that occurs when visual and auditory information clash, causing the brain to alter its perception based on what the eyes see rather than what the ears actually hear. This effect was discovered by psychologist Harry McGurk in the 1970s and has since become a classic example of how our senses interact in surprising ways. The McGurk effect is best demonstrated through a simple experiment. If you listen to a recording of someone saying the syllable ba, 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 but watch a video of the same person mouthing fa, 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 your brain often overrides the actual sound and you end up hearing fa, fa, fa instead. Even though the audio hasn't changed, your eyes trick your ears by influencing what you think you're hearing. This happens because the brain processes sensory information together, rather than independently, relying on multiple cues to interpret the world around us. As a result, visual input can sometimes dominate auditory perception. In everyday life, this effect explains why people naturally read lip movements, facial expressions, and body language to better understand speech. When the visual cues don't match the sounds, the brain struggles to reconcile the mismatch, often leading to distorted or altered perception. The McGurk effect is not just a laboratory curiosity. It happens constantly in real-world situations, especially in noisy environments. When background noise interferes with hearing, watching someone's mouth movements helps fill in the gaps, making speech easier to comprehend. This effect also shows up in media like movies and TV shows. When subtitles don't match the spoken dialogue, viewers' perceptions of what is being said can shift. The McGurk effect has important implications for communication and language learning, especially for individuals who rely on lip reading, such as people with hearing impairments. They may experience greater challenges when audio and visual signals are out of sync. Moreover, the McGurk effect highlights that the brain is not a passive receiver of sensory information, but an active constructor of perception. What we experience is not just raw sensory data. It is a combination of inputs that the mind interprets using context, patterns, and expectations. Understanding this effect can help increase awareness of how perception works and remind us that our senses can be deceived. If you ever find yourself mishearing something, ask whether your brain is being influenced by what you see. Together with other cognitive biases like the frequency illusion, the McGurk effect reveals how our brains filter and reinterpret reality. While the frequency illusion makes us notice certain things more often once we become aware of them, the McGurk effect blends visual and auditory information to change what we think we hear. These biases remind us that perception is not merely about the objective world, but about how the brain organizes and makes sense of sensory information. The Barnum Effect. The Barnum Effect refers to a psychological bias where people are naturally drawn to vague, general statements that feel deeply personal, even though those statements could apply to almost anyone. This effect explains why horoscopes, personality tests, fortune tellers, and even vague compliments often feel uncannily accurate, despite being deliberately broad and non-specific. The name comes from P.T. Barnum, the famous showman and circus promoter who once said, "There's a sucker born every minute." Barnum understood that people are eager to believe personalized truths about themselves, even when those truths are generic and could fit just about anyone. The Barnum effect was first scientifically studied by psychologist Bertram Forer in 1948. In a classic experiment, Forer gave his students a fake personality test, then handed each student the exact same personality analysis, filled with broad, general statements like, "You sometimes have doubts about whether you made the right decision," and "You prefer to be liked but can also be critical of yourself." When asked to rate how accurately the description fit them, the students gave it an average score of 4.3 out of 5, even though every single student received the same identical analysis. This powerful experiment demonstrated how people tend to accept vague descriptions as uniquely their own. The Barnum effect works because people have a strong desire for self-knowledge and understanding. When reading a horoscope, fortune cookie message, or personality analysis, their brains naturally fill in the gaps to make the information feel personally relevant. People tend to remember the parts that seem to fit them well, and conveniently ignore or forget the parts that don't match. This selective focus is why cold reading, the technique used by psychics and fortune tellers, feels so convincing. Psychics often offer broad, general statements that their audience interprets as personal insights. Marketers and advertisers frequently exploit the Barnum Effect to create emotional connections with customers. By using flattering, broad descriptions, brands make customers feel understood and valued, increasing trust and loyalty. Personality-based quizzes on social media, such as "What kind of leader are you?" or "Which celebrity matches your personality?" use this trick to engage users and collect valuable data, all while making people feel as if they are discovering deep truths about themselves. Understanding the Barnum Effect is crucial for developing better critical thinking skills. The next time you find a horoscope, fortune, or personality test shockingly accurate, pause and ask yourself, could this description apply to almost anyone? By recognizing this bias, you can avoid falling prey to vague, generic statements and instead focus on real, evidence-based insights about yourself. Becoming aware of the Barnum Effect empowers you to be more skeptical of overly broad claims and more thoughtful about how you interpret information. The self-fulfilling prophecy. The self-fulfilling prophecy is a powerful psychological phenomenon where what you believe about yourself and the world actually shapes your reality. When you hold certain expectations, whether consciously or unconsciously, you start acting in ways that increase the likelihood those expectations will come true. In other words, your beliefs influence your behavior, which then influences the outcomes you experience, confirming the original belief. This effect was famously demonstrated by psychologist Robert Rosenthal in a classic experiment involving teachers and students. Rosenthal told teachers that certain students in their class had been identified as academic bloomers, expected to show significant progress during the school year. In reality, these students were randomly chosen and had no special advantage. Yet by the end of the year, those students performed noticeably better than their peers. The reason? Teachers subtly changed how they interacted with the bloomers, offering more encouragement, attention, and higher expectations. These positive interactions motivated the students who internalized the belief that they could succeed, worked harder, and improved their performance, making the teacher's initial false expectation a reality. The self-fulfilling prophecy operates in many areas of life. For example, if someone believes they are bad at math, they may approach the subject with low confidence, put in less effort, and ultimately perform poorly, thereby confirming their original negative belief. Conversely, if someone believes they are charismatic and likable, they tend to behave confidently, prompting positive responses from others, which reinforces their belief. This effect also strongly impacts relationships. If a person fears their partner will leave, they might become insecure, controlling, or distant, which can push their partner away and bring about the breakup they dreaded. On the other hand, believing a relationship will thrive encourages behaviors that strengthen the bond, increasing the chances of a lasting partnership. The self-fulfilling prophecy extends beyond personal beliefs to health, career, and social status. Patients who expect to recover from illness often heal faster, while those who anticipate negative outcomes may suffer worse health due to stress and anxiety. At work, employees who expect success are more likely to work harder, take risks, and show confidence, leading to real achievement. Conversely, those who expect failure may avoid challenges, resulting in stagnation or poor performance. One of the most dangerous aspects of this effect is how it can reinforce negative cycles. When individuals are labeled as lazy, troublemakers, or incapable, whether in school, work, or society, they may internalize these identities and behave accordingly, making the label a self-fulfilling reality. Societal stereotypes work similarly. When groups are repeatedly told they are less capable, these messages harm confidence and ambition, creating barriers to success. However, the self-fulfilling prophecy can also be harnessed for positive growth. By consciously setting optimistic expectations, people can influence their behaviors and outcomes. Adopting a growth mindset, where challenges are viewed as opportunities rather than failures, creates a self-fulfilling cycle of effort and success. Recognizing this effect empowers individuals to break negative patterns and cultivate positive ones. If you believe something bad is inevitable, Question whether your actions might be contributing to making it true. To change your outcome, start by changing your expectations and aligning your behavior with the reality you want to create. Both the Barnum Effect and the self-fulfilling prophecy illustrate how beliefs shape perception and reality. While the Barnum Effect causes people to see vague statements as uniquely personal, the self-fulfilling prophecy transforms expectations into actual lived experiences. Understanding these biases enhances self-awareness, critical thinking, and gives you greater control over your mindset and actions. The contrast principle. The contrast principle is a psychological effect that reveals how our perception of something doesn't depend solely on its own qualities, but heavily on what it is compared to. In other words, people judge things as better or worse based not on their absolute value, but on the relative difference from what they experienced just before. This bias subtly influences decision-making, perception, and even emotions in everyday life. For example, if you lift a lightweight object right after holding something very heavy, the lighter object will feel even lighter than it actually is. Similarly, if you see a $2,000 designer jacket first and then a $300 jacket, the second jacket suddenly feels like a bargain, even though $300 is still expensive on its own. Or imagine eating a mediocre meal right after a terrible one. The mediocre meal will taste amazing by comparison. Marketers and salespeople take full advantage of the contrast principle. When trying to sell high-priced products, they often show customers the most expensive option first. Once the brain has anchored on that high price, all the other options appear more reasonable and affordable in comparison. Realtors may show a rundown, overpriced house first, so the next house, while still pricey, seems like a great deal. High-end restaurants often list extremely expensive items on their menus, knowing that all the other dishes will then feel comparatively affordable. The contrast principle also plays a big role in attractiveness and social judgments. Someone entering a room right after a supermodel might seem less attractive than they would on their own. Conversely, an average-looking person surrounded by less attractive people will seem more appealing than usual. In job interviews, a strong candidate appears even stronger if they follow a weaker applicant. Likewise, a speaker seems more impressive if they come after a boring presenter. Expectations are heavily shaped by the contrast principle. If you expect an experience to be bad and it turns out okay, it will feel better than expected. On the other hand, if you anticipate something amazing but the outcome is merely okay, it will feel disappointing. This is why people often adjust their expectations to avoid disappointment. They brace themselves for the worst and end up pleasantly surprised. To use the contrast principle to your advantage, it helps to control what you compare things to. Instead of measuring your current success against someone far ahead, compare it to where you started. Instead of feeling your home is small after seeing a mansion, compare it to places with less space. Recognizing how comparison shapes your perception can help you avoid unnecessary dissatisfaction and see things more objectively, leading to greater contentment and clearer decision-making. Repetition, persuasion. Repetition persuasion is a psychological effect where the more often people hear something, the more likely they are to believe it, regardless of whether it is true or not. This happens because repeated exposure to a statement makes it seem more credible, even in the absence of any actual evidence to support it. The brain naturally prefers familiarity. When information is repeated, it becomes easier to process, and the brain mistakes this ease of processing for truth. Something that might seem questionable the first time you hear it can start to feel like common knowledge after hearing it 5 or 10 times. This effect is widely used by politicians, advertisers, and media outlets to influence public opinion. Political slogans such as "Make America Great Again," "Yes We Can," or "Stronger," together are repeated endlessly to ensure they stick in people's minds. Advertisers similarly repeat brand names, jingles, and slogans, knowing that even if people don't consciously believe the message at first, repeated exposure subtly shifts perception over time. Repetition persuasion is particularly dangerous when it comes to misinformation and propaganda. False statements, if repeated often enough, can begin to feel true, not because they are supported by facts, but simply because they become familiar. This explains why conspiracy theories, fake news, and misleading statistics spread so easily. People often assume that if they have heard something multiple times, it must be true. This effect also plays out in social interactions. If someone repeats a false rumor about a person, it can shape how others view them, even in the absence of real evidence. Likewise, when individuals repeat negative self-talk such as, "I'm not good enough," their brains begin to internalize these thoughts, reinforcing self-doubt and limiting potential. On the other hand, repeating positive affirmations like, "I am capable" and "I am strong" can help rewire the brain's belief system, combating the negative effects of repetition persuasion. To defend against this bias, it's important to always question the information you receive. Even if you have heard it many times, ask yourself whether the statement is actually true or if it just feels true because of repetition. Fact-check sources diligently, avoid relying on familiarity as a measure of truth, and be aware of how repetition shapes your own beliefs, whether you encounter it in media, marketing, or your personal mindset. Both the contrast principle and repetition persuasion demonstrate how context and exposure influence perception. While the contrast principle distorts how we judge things based on what they are compared to, repetition persuasion alters beliefs through sheer repeated exposure. Understanding these effects empowers you to think more critically, resist manipulation, and make clearer, more rational decisions. The fear-then-relief technique. The fear-then-relief technique is a powerful psychological manipulation tactic that leverages the intense emotions caused by fear, followed by a sudden sense of relief, to make people more compliant and suggestible. When individuals experience fear or anxiety, their brains narrow focus entirely on the perceived threat, triggering a fight-or-flight response. Once that fear is quickly replaced by relief, through reassurance, a solution or distraction, the brain relaxes, resulting in a psychological drop in resistance. This brief moment of vulnerability makes people significantly more likely to agree to requests or follow instructions. This method works by disrupting normal, rational thought patterns. When in a fearful state, critical thinking is diminished, making it easier for manipulative messages to slip past logical defenses. For instance, scam emails often use this technique by first alarming recipients that their bank accounts have been compromised, causing immediate panic. Then, they offer a quick fix, usually a link to click to restore their account. In that moment of fear, recipients are less likely to question the email's legitimacy and more prone to comply. The fear-then-relief technique is also commonly exploited in sales and marketing. Companies warn customers about serious risks, such as identity theft, home security threats, or hidden health dangers, then immediately present their product as the perfect stress-relieving solution. Infomercials frequently use this strategy, first highlighting how awful life can be without their product, and then offering an easy, comforting solution that makes viewers eager to buy. Beyond marketing, this technique is found in law enforcement, politics, and social control. Authorities may present looming crises or threats, then introduce policies or laws framed as the only way to avoid disaster. Historically, governments have used fear, then relief, to justify wars, surveillance programs, and emergency restrictions, leading the public to accept sacrificing freedoms in exchange for a sense of safety. Even in everyday life, the fear-then-relief technique is present. For example, a boss might first criticize an employee's performance, triggering fear of job loss or failure, but then quickly reassure them with words like, "I believe in you, and if you work extra hours, I know you can turn this around." The fear of losing a job, followed by relief, increases the employee's likelihood of complying with demands. To defend against the fear-then-relief technique, it's important to pause before reacting when fear is triggered. Ask yourself whether the fear is justified and if the proposed solution genuinely serves your best interest. Recognizing when fear is being used as a manipulation tool helps you stay calm, think critically, and remain in control of your decisions instead of acting impulsively. The sleeper effect. The sleeper effect is a fascinating psychological phenomenon where some persuasive messages that initially seem weak, unconvincing, or even dismissed can gradually gain influence over time. Unlike most messages that have their strongest impact immediately, arguments affected by the sleeper effect become more persuasive as time passes, especially if they are repeated frequently. This occurs because people tend to forget the source of the information faster than they forget the message itself. When individuals first hear a weak argument, they often reject it, particularly if it comes from an untrustworthy or questionable source. However, as time goes on, they may forget where the information came from, while still retaining the message itself. This separation between message and source means that the once discounted information starts to seem more credible, making people more likely to believe it later on. The sleeper effect helps explain how misinformation and false claims can spread despite initial skepticism. Even if people recognize a statement as unreliable or false at first, constant exposure over time can embed the message deep in their subconscious. Later, when they recall the information, they may fail to remember it was originally discredited, leading them to accept it as true. This slow and subtle influence makes the sleeper effect a powerful tool in propaganda, marketing, and media manipulation. Advertisers, for instance, may present bold or questionable claims, knowing that although these might seem exaggerated or misleading initially, repeated exposure over time will normalize the message and make it seem acceptable. Similarly, political campaigns frequently use this tactic by spreading half-truths, emotionally charged statements, or misleading information. Even if voters dismiss these claims at first, the messages linger and shape future opinions. Research shows that negative political ads, often proven false, still leave a lasting impact because people remember the criticism but forget the rebuttal. This explains why politicians repeatedly use misleading attacks. Over time, false claims become accepted as fact. The sleeper effect also plays a role in shaping social stereotypes and cultural attitudes. Ideas introduced through movies, music, or popular conversations might not seem convincing immediately, but through persistence and repetition, they gradually influence societal beliefs. This is how messages about gender roles, beauty standards, or success become deeply ingrained in people's minds, even if they were initially met with skepticism or resistance. To protect yourself from the sleeper effect, it is essential to always consider the source of any information, especially when it seems controversial or questionable. Actively remind yourself where you heard something before accepting it as true. Fact-checking, and regularly re-evaluating your beliefs can help prevent weak arguments and false information from becoming deeply rooted in your thinking. Both the fear-then-relief technique and the sleeper effect demonstrate how psychological manipulation can shape people's decisions and beliefs over time. While the fear-then-relief technique creates immediate compliance through emotional shock and relief, the sleeper effect slowly builds persuasion by making ideas seem more credible through repeated exposure and fading memory of their dubious origins. Understanding these effects strengthens critical thinking, increases resistance to manipulation, and gives you greater control over your own beliefs and decisions. Priming effect. People often like to believe that their decisions are the result of careful logic and conscious thought. However, much of what influences our choices happens subtly and unconsciously through a psychological phenomenon known as the priming effect. Priming occurs when exposure to certain words, images, sounds, or experiences shapes our subsequent behavior, thoughts, and decisions without us even realizing it. The brain constantly forms associations, so when you encounter one stimulus, it primes related ideas and responses that follow. For example, if you see the word yellow, your brain quickly makes a connection to banana, speeding up recognition because those concepts are linked in memory. Hearing calming music in a store can make you more likely to linger and spend money, while being exposed to words like polite and patient might unconsciously make you behave more politely in the next conversation. These subtle cues gently nudge our minds in certain directions without our conscious awareness. The priming effect is widely used in advertising and marketing to influence consumer behavior. Restaurants often play slow, soothing music to encourage diners to stay longer and order more. Luxury brands use elegant imagery and classical music to prime customers into associating their products with sophistication and status. Supermarkets strategically place fresh flowers and baked goods near entrances to create a welcoming atmosphere, priming shoppers to feel comfortable and more willing to spend. Priming doesn't just affect buying habits, it also shapes judgments and social behavior. Studies have found that people primed with thoughts of old age tend to walk more slowly afterward, often without realizing why. Similarly, exposure to words associated with rudeness makes individuals more likely to interrupt conversations. Even colors have priming effects. Seeing red can evoke feelings of urgency or caution, while blue is often linked to calmness and trust. News media can prime public perception as well. When crime stories are repeatedly highlighted, people may overestimate the actual danger around them, even if crime rates remain stable. Watching a movie centered on betrayal may unconsciously increase feelings of suspicion in personal relationships. Because priming influences memory and learning, it's also important in education. When teachers introduce concepts with positive framing, students are more likely to engage enthusiastically. Conversely, if someone is primed with negative expectations, like being told a task is difficult, they may perform worse simply because their mind was prepared for struggle. To use the priming effect to your advantage, surround yourself with cues that encourage the behaviors or feelings you want to foster. Place motivational quotes around your workspace if you want to boost productivity. Keep healthy foods like fruit visible while hiding less healthy snacks if you want to eat better. Read inspiring success stories before tackling challenges to build confidence. Equally important is becoming aware of how your environment, media, and conversations are constantly priming your thoughts and actions. Noticing these subtle influences helps you make more conscious choices, rather than reacting automatically to your surroundings. The peak end rule. People don't judge their experiences based on the entire duration or every single moment they lived through. Instead, they tend to evaluate events primarily by two key parts: the most intense or emotional moment, the peak, and how the experience ended. This phenomenon is called the peak end rule, a cognitive bias that greatly influences how memories of events are formed and recalled. It was discovered by psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who found that people's lasting impressions depend far less on the overall quality or length of an experience, and much more on the peak moment and the ending. Even if an experience was mostly positive or mostly negative, the parts that stand out in memory tend to be the most emotionally charged moment and the conclusion, while everything in between fades into the background. This explains why vacations, relationships, movies, or even painful medical procedures are often remembered differently than they were actually experienced. For example, a vacation might be uneventful overall, but if it included one breathtaking moment, such as watching a stunning sunset from a mountain peak, that single memory can define the entire trip in someone's mind. Similarly, a long and mostly stable relationship that ends with a dramatic breakup might be remembered as painful, overshadowing years of happiness. When it comes to movies, if a film drags on slowly for 2 hours but delivers an amazing, emotionally charged climax, people will likely leave the theater thinking the movie was great, influenced heavily by the peak end rule. Businesses and customer service industries are very aware of this effect and often design experiences accordingly. Smart companies make sure the peak moment is thrilling or satisfying and that the ending leaves a positive impression. For instance, amusement parks strategically place their most exciting rides in the middle of the visit and finish the day with fireworks or entertaining shows at the exit to ensure visitors leave feeling delighted. Restaurants may serve a free dessert or mint at the end of a meal, knowing that the final moments strongly affect how the whole dining experience is remembered. The peak end rule also applies to pain and discomfort. Studies have shown that patients who undergo painful medical procedures but experience a gradual decrease in pain toward the end tend to recall the experience as less unpleasant overall compared to those whose pain ends abruptly. The key takeaway is that a gradual, less painful ending makes an experience more tolerable in memory. Understanding the peak end rule can improve decision-making and the way experiences are designed. If you want to create a lasting positive impression, focus on creating a powerful peak moment and a satisfying conclusion. Whether planning an event, managing a project, or ending a challenging relationship or job, try to ensure the final moments are enjoyable or positive, as that's how the entire experience will be remembered. Being aware of this cognitive bias can also help avoid distorted memories. Instead of letting one intense moment color your whole perception of an event, take a step back and try to evaluate the experience more objectively. Ask yourself whether the relationship was really terrible, or if you are just focusing on the last fight. Was the vacation truly boring, or are you forgetting all the smaller enjoyable moments? Both the priming effect and the peak end rule reveal how memory and perception are shaped by unconscious mental processes. Priming subtly influences behavior based on prior exposure to cues, while the peak end rule distorts memory by emphasizing select moments. Recognizing these effects allows for more mindful decision-making, improved communication, and the ability to intentionally shape experiences rather than being unknowingly controlled by these biases. The status quo bias people naturally tend to resist change, even when better options are clearly available. This tendency is known as the status quo bias, a psychological phenomenon where individuals prefer to maintain their current situation rather than making changes, even if those changes could improve their lives. This bias exists because the brain values familiarity and predictability, which feels safe and comfortable. Change, on the other hand, often involves effort, uncertainty, and risk, which can trigger anxiety and discomfort. As a result, people frequently default to inaction simply because the status quo feels easier and less threatening, regardless of whether logic or evidence suggests they should switch gears. For example, one notable study found that when employees were automatically enrolled in retirement savings plans, most rarely opted out, even if they had previously neglected to enroll themselves. This highlights how powerful the status quo bias can be. Sticking with the default option is often less mentally demanding than actively making a change, even when the change would be beneficial. The status quo bias also influences consumer behavior. Many people remain loyal to the same brands for years, not necessarily because those brands are the best, but because they are familiar. In relationships, individuals sometimes stay in unsatisfying or even harmful situations simply because leaving feels too difficult, or because they fear the uncertainty of the unknown. Marketers and companies exploit this bias by making their products or services the default option. Subscription services, for example, rely heavily on automatic renewals, for knowing that many customers will continue paying without going through the hassle of canceling. This leverages the tendency for people to stick with what they already have, even if better deals or options exist elsewhere. While the status quo bias can provide comfort, it can also hold people back from personal growth and progress. It causes resistance to learning new skills, improving health habits, or exploring fresh opportunities. Organizations are also affected. Employees often resist new processes or innovations, even when those changes are clearly more efficient or effective. The fear of disrupting the familiar routine can slow down improvement and adaptation. To overcome the status quo bias, it's important to reframe change as an opportunity rather than a threat. Instead of automatically fearing the unknown, ask yourself whether the current situation is truly the best option, or if you are simply avoiding change out of habit or fear. Embracing small, calculated risks can lead to major improvements, but only if you challenge the instinct to cling to the familiar. Recognizing this bias in yourself can open the door to new possibilities and help you make decisions that better serve your goals and well-being. Default bias. People are naturally more likely to stick with pre-selected or default options than to make an active choice, even when an alternative might clearly be better for them. This psychological tendency is known as the default bias, a cognitive bias where individuals prefer to accept the default setting rather than actively change something, even when making that change requires very little effort. This bias exists because decision-making consumes mental energy. Weighing options, analyzing risks, and making new choices takes time and cognitive resources. Since the brain favors efficiency and minimizing effort, it often defaults to the easiest path, accepting whatever option is already set in place. One of the most well-known studies illustrating default bias looked at organ donation rates in various countries. In nations where citizens were automatically enrolled as organ donors but had the option to opt out, donation rates exceeded 90%. Conversely, In countries where people had to actively opt in to become donors, rates dropped as low as 15%. This stark contrast wasn't because people held dramatically different opinions about organ donation. It was largely due to the power of default settings and the effort required to change them. Businesses, governments, and technology companies are well aware of the influence of default bias and often design default options strategically to guide behavior. Social media platforms, for example, often default users into accepting data tracking and sharing settings, knowing that only a small fraction will take the time to adjust their privacy preferences. Streaming services automatically renew subscriptions to capitalize on the fact that users usually won't cancel unless they consciously decide to do so. Employers often enroll workers into benefit programs by default, which significantly increases participation rates simply because opting out requires extra steps. Default bias also shapes countless everyday decisions. Many people never change their phone's factory settings, stick with preset app permissions, or continue using the same financial plans or insurance policies year after year without reviewing them. People tend to eat the portion sizes they're served, rely on default recommendations, and continue using outdated software or systems simply because changing these routines feels like unnecessary extra work. While default bias can sometimes have positive effects, such as encouraging saving for retirement or promoting healthy habits, it can also lead to missed opportunities and suboptimal outcomes. Countless individuals remain locked into bad financial plans, unnecessary subscriptions, or outdated habits simply because they never actively choose a better alternative. The best way to counteract default bias is to pause regularly and critically review default choices instead of automatically accepting what's presented. Ask yourself, is this truly the best option for me, or am I just taking the easiest route? Taking small intentional steps like adjusting settings, reviewing recurring expenses, or actively selecting products and services can lead to significantly better financial, personal, and professional outcomes. Both the status quo bias and the default bias reveal how people tend to resist change, even when switching would be clearly beneficial. While status quo bias makes people cling to familiarity, default bias causes them to stick with pre-selected options simply because it requires less effort. Becoming aware of these biases helps promote more intentional decision-making, smarter choices, and greater control over the direction of one's life instead of passively accepting whatever is handed to them. The Reciprocity Principle. When someone does something for you, you naturally feel a strong urge to return the favor. This is known as the Reciprocity Principle, a psychological tendency deeply embedded in human nature where people feel obligated to repay kindness, favors, or gestures, even if they never asked for them in the first place. This bias has roots in our evolutionary past and the way social bonds were formed in ancient societies. Long ago, sharing resources and helping others increased the chances of survival for everyone involved. The unspoken rule was simple. If someone helped you today, you would be expected to help them in return sometime later. Over generations, this evolved into an automatic social norm that makes most people uncomfortable when they feel indebted or unable to reciprocate. The reciprocity principle is one of the most powerful tools in persuasion, sales, and negotiation. Businesses have mastered this tactic by offering free samples, trial periods, or small gifts, knowing that many customers will feel an unconscious obligation to make a purchase in return. For example, when a waiter offers extra mints or writes a personalized thank you note on the bill, customers often tip more generously. Charities use this technique as well. Sending free address labels or small gifts in the mail leads to a significant increase in donations, even from people who had no initial intention to give. This natural human response to receiving something first creates a subtle but effective pressure to give back. The reciprocity principle also shapes everyday social relationships and interactions. If a friend helps you move, you're likely to feel obligated to help them with something when they ask in return. If a coworker covers your shift, you are more inclined to do the same for them later. In dating and casual social settings, people who offer small acts of kindness, compliments, favors, or assistance are perceived as more likable. The recipient then often feels motivated to reciprocate the kindness, strengthening social bonds and mutual goodwill. However, the power of reciprocity can also be exploited or manipulated. Some individuals intentionally give small, calculated favors with the hidden goal of getting something larger or more valuable in return. This is why high-pressure salespeople might offer free perks to lure customers into purchases, why scammers may send gifts before making requests, and why some people use guilt to coerce others into doing favors they wouldn't otherwise agree to. Understanding this principle helps you recognize when it's being used for genuine connection and when it's a manipulative tactic. To use the reciprocity principle wisely, it's best to give without expecting anything back, fostering genuine generosity and trust. At the same time, be aware of situations where you might feel unfairly pressured to return a favor that wasn't truly generous or voluntary. Remember that you don't owe anyone beyond what feels reasonable and fair to you. Reciprocity should be a foundation for honest, mutual support, not a tool for obligation or manipulation. The false memory effect. Many people assume their memories are perfect, unchanging records of the past. But in truth, memories are highly malleable and far from reliable. This is known as the false memory effect, a psychological phenomenon where individuals can be convinced that they remember events or details that never actually happened. Unlike a camera or a hard drive that stores exact copies of images or files, the brain reconstructs memories each time they are recalled. This reconstruction process involves filling in missing gaps using expectations, emotions, beliefs, and outside influences. As a result, memories can gradually become distorted, altered, or even completely fabricated without the person realizing it. False memories can easily be created through suggestion, leading questions, or exposure to incorrect information. One of the most famous studies demonstrating this effect was conducted by psychologist Elizabeth Loftus. In her experiment, participants watched footage of a car accident and were later asked questions using different wording. For example, some were asked, "How fast was the car going when it smashed into the other vehicle?" While others heard, "How fast was the car going when it hit the other vehicle?" Those who heard the word smashed consistently remembered the cars moving faster and the crash as more severe, even though all participants saw the exact same video. This study highlights how subtle changes in language can alter memory and perception. This effect explains why eyewitness testimonies in legal cases can be unreliable. When witnesses hear other people's versions of events or are exposed to misleading information, they can unknowingly incorporate those false details into their own memories. This phenomenon has contributed to wrongful convictions, where confident but mistaken witnesses testify about events that never took place. The consequences in the justice system can be severe and life-altering. False memories aren't limited to legal settings. They also appear in personal relationships and childhood recollections. For instance, if someone repeatedly hears stories about being clumsy as a child, they might start to believe they remember specific embarrassing moments, even if those moments never actually occurred. Family groups sometimes share collectively misremembered events, where a false narrative is reinforced over time until it is accepted as truth by all involved. This shared distortion can shape family dynamics and personal identities in unexpected ways. The media plays a major role in the creation and spread of false memories. After major news events, news outlets and social media often circulate exaggerated or misleading narratives. Repeated exposure to these stories can cause people to believe they personally witnessed or remember things that never actually happened, simply because they have heard about them so often. One well-known example is the Mandela Effect, where large groups of people share the same incorrect memories. Some individuals insist the Monopoly man wore a monocle, when in fact, he never did. Others remember the children's book series as the Berenstain Bears, whereas the correct name is the Berenstain Bears. These collective false memories likely arise from similar mental associations rather than actual past experiences. To protect yourself from the false memory effect, it is important to question details that feel unusually clear or too perfect. If a memory is vivid but lacks supporting evidence, consider that it might have been influenced or altered by external sources. Keeping written records, photos, or other objective evidence can help distinguish between genuine memories and reconstructed ones. Being aware of this effect fosters a more accurate understanding of your own past and encourages critical thinking about what you believe you remember. Both the Reciprocity Principle and the false memory effect illustrate how our minds are shaped by social pressures and cognitive distortions. One influences behavior by creating an obligation to return favors, while the other alters perceived reality by convincing people they recall events that never happened. Recognizing these biases helps maintain stronger personal boundaries and a clearer, more truthful perception of reality.